Chapter 2274. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator's heart was filled with an indescribable joy. The light of heaven and earth enveloped his body and continuously revealed his powerful might and supreme ability in all directions. After being suppressed for such a long time, he could finally unleash his full strength without any restraint. It was obviously an extremely exciting thing for him. "Ruler, now is not the time to be happy." A Tao Master's disciple spoke up at this moment. Since they had already acknowledged the middle-aged itinerant cultivator as the true ruler of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, even the Tao Master's disciples had no choice but to address him as ruler. Hearing this, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator frowned as if he was somewhat displeased. However, it was obvious that what the Tao Master's disciple said was the truth. Even if he was displeased, he could not ignore it. Immediately, he stopped what he was doing. With a slight thought, the general trend that covered the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path began to tremble slightly. As it trembled, the flow of time in the vortex, which was a group of worlds that had fused together, began to accelerate rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had already accelerated from its original state to a speed that far exceeded the normal flow of time by countless times. An inexplicable sense of relief emerged in the hearts of many cultivators at this moment. This was a kind of relief that came from finally putting down the worries in the bottom of their hearts. Feeling this relief, all the cultivators' expressions became slightly more relaxed. No matter what the middle-aged itinerant cultivator's scheme was, at least he had fulfilled the first step of his promise and had given them enough time. "Everyone, let's hurry up. I can already sense that the powerhouse will complete his task in a few days at most. If you still haven't completed your plan by the time he completes his task, I'm afraid it will be troublesome," the middle-aged itinerant cultivator said. "A few days?" Many cultivators could not help but exclaim. Apart from the Tao Master's disciples with strong foundations, let alone a few days, other itinerant cultivators were not confident that they could reach the level of ascension even in a few hundred years. Of course it's the outside world. For our many worlds this time should be close to 10 billion years. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator smiled and said. Hearing this, many cultivators heaved a sigh of relief. Close to 10 billion years was not a long time for most cultivators. However, if they were given close to 10 billion years to cultivate, they had absolute confidence that they would be able to achieve the corresponding breakthrough. For a time, the atmosphere relaxed once more. Many cultivators could not help but smile. Seeing this, the middle-aged rogue cultivator ignored them. At this time, he was quietly observing Luo Fan, who was outside the large world group, through the general trend. At this moment, Luo Fan was hovering in the middle of the Genesis energy. His body didn't seem to be any different from before. However, the middle-aged cultivator could clearly sense that something that could endlessly threaten him was brewing in his body at this moment. Once this kind of existence was formed, even if he had become the master of the fourth level, and could use the light of heaven and earth that he had comprehended from the fifth level of the road to Tao Master, it would still be difficult for him to resist. In this way, the wisest way for him to deal with Luo Fan would have been to take advantage of the fact that that kind of existence had not finished brewing. However, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator could clearly sense through the Genesis that if he attacked, the existence that was brewing in Luo Fan's body would definitely be formed immediately. At that time, he would not even have the few days of preparation time that he had originally planned. Under such circumstances, unless the middle-aged itinerant cultivator was stupid, why would he attack Luo Fan at this time? Seeing such a great opportunity in front of him, but being unable to seize it at all, it was easy to imagine how uncomfortable this feeling was. At this moment, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator's mood seemed to be a little abnormal and there was an inexplicable annoyance leaking from his body. As the master of the fourth level of the road to Tao Master, all his mood changes would have a corresponding impact on the fourth level of the road to Tao Master. For example, at this time, his mood became irritated, which caused the stability of the entire Genesis to be challenged. Faint chaos began to spread from the center in all directions. This affected the mood of many cultivators, whether they were itinerant cultivators or disciples of the Tao Master, and they became slightly irritated. Fortunately, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator quickly controlled his irritation and his mood returned to its original calm state. This prevented the influence from spreading endlessly and prevented the cultivators from falling into a new round of war. Forget it, let's see if I can break his seal first. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator thought to himself. As for Luo Fan, his heart was now full of vigilance and fear. This kind of wariness made it impossible for him to have any thoughts of revenge after suffering such a huge loss. At this moment, after regaining his power, the biggest thought in his mind was to get away from Luo Fan, to get away from the fourth level. For the other cultivators on the fourth level, the only way to get away from the fourth level was to do something they had never done before, which was to ascend from the fourth level to the fifth level. This was almost like opening a path from nothing, so it was naturally quite difficult. The failure rate was also quite high. However, it was different for him. Compared to the other cultivators, he came from the fifth level. To him, leaving the fourth level was just following the path that originally existed to return home. In comparison, the difficulty was much lower than that of the disciples of the Tao Masters. However, this was only the beginning. If the other itinerant cultivators and disciples of the Tao Masters wanted to ascend to the fifth level, they would have to borrow the power of the entire Tao Master's path. Unless Luo Fan had the strength to resist the entire Tao Master's path, he would not be able to suppress the ascension and imprison them in the fourth level no matter what he did. The situation was obviously completely different for the middle-aged itinerant cultivator. He had gone against the Tao Master's path to return to the fourth level from the fifth level, which was against the fundamental rules of the Tao Master's path. If he was discovered by the Tao Master's path, he would be directly imprisoned in the Tao Master's prison. Under such circumstances, it was too late for him to avoid the power of the Tao Master's path. How could he borrow the power of the Tao Master's path to return? Therefore, if he wanted to return, he could only rely on himself. He could only rely on his own strength, which had been proven to be inferior to that of Luo Fan. In this way, his return could naturally be imprisoned and restricted. This was also what Luo Fan had been doing all this time. In other words, as long as the other itinerant cultivators and disciples of the Tao Masters reached the level of ascension and completed the various requirements of ascension, they would naturally be able to ascend to the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. No one could stop them, and no power could seal them. However, for the middle-aged itinerant cultivator, unless he could break the barrier that Luo Fan had originally built and break his seal, he would never be able to return to the fifth level. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator was naturally aware of this. At this moment, he frowned as countless thoughts, countless mysteries, and infinite mysteries flashed wildly in his mind. Although the strength that he could display was much weaker than that of Luo Fan, who had obtained the light of heaven and earth, he was, after all, an expert who had undergone the baptism of the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. The intricacy and complexity of the various methods he possessed had reached an unimaginable level. This method that seemed to be stuck between a rock and a hard place was obviously not a hopeless situation for him. He had countless secret techniques that could deal with the current situation. Countless information and ideas kept reverberating in his mind at this moment. And he was also using his own control of the general trend to constantly experience the barrier that imprisoned him and prevented him from returning to the fifth level. Just now, he had spoken in an awe-inspiring manner, as if he was willing to sacrifice everything to help all the cultivators transcend. However, in reality, all of this was just for the position of ruler. Now that he had obtained the position of ruler, he did not have any thoughts of sacrificing anything for the many cultivators. The reason why he did not directly abandon the many cultivators and leave by himself was because he had not found the weakness of the barrier and could not return to the 5th level by himself. One could imagine that once he found a way to bypass or break the barrier, he would definitely immediately abandon all the cultivators and directly return to the 5th level by going against his own path. Most of the cultivators were actually aware of all of this. Of course, perhaps they were not sure what the middle-aged itinerant cultivator was doing, but they could imagine that he would definitely not do his best like he had said. If they were only waiting for the middle-aged itinerant cultivator to rescue them, they would definitely be completely abandoned at some point in time. Therefore, at this moment they seemed to be relaxed, but in fact they were rather anxious to carry out their previous plan. The itinerant cultivators under the Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group that was similar to the Tao of Cultivation, and the itinerant cultivators even worked hard to get close to the Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group, trying their best to obtain the various comprehension that they needed to ascend from the Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group. Very soon, the Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group in the middle of the vortex fell into an indescribable tension. 10 billion years might seem like a long time, but it only took the blink of an eye for those who immersed themselves in cultivation. Before they knew it, more than 3 billion years had passed. During these 3 billion years, the communication between the cultivators had reached an unimaginable level. Not only had the itinerant cultivators made great progress, but even the Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group had also made great progress. This kind of progress caused everyone to faintly emit an aura of transcendence. This aura was so mysterious that it seemed to be drawing upon some mysterious and wonderful power to take them away from the Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group, the vortex, and the 4th level. On this day, a Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group transmitted his voice to the middle-aged itinerant cultivator. "Ruler, we are ready. Ruler, please take action and let us transcend." His voice was directly transmitted into the ears of the middle-aged itinerant cultivator who was deep in thought, causing him to suddenly wake up from the endless mysteries. After waking up, he glanced at the cultivators in confusion. He frowned as soon as he did so. He did not expect it to take so long to find the flaw in the barrier and think about how to break it. He did not manage to deduce the flaw even after all the itinerant cultivators had received a hint of ascension. This kind of situation made him a little annoyed. However, his control over his own emotions was superb after all. This kind of irritation did not last long in his heart. Even the general trend had not had time to be affected by this irritation before it returned to its calm state. "I think you should investigate a little more and consolidate your understanding," he said indifferently. With that, he waved his hand. The entire Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group surged, and layers of strange barriers appeared between the many Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group. After such a long period of development, the Tao Master's Path of Communication World Group that had been damaged in the many battles had unknowingly recovered. Among them were the small worlds that had already been destroyed. In other words, at this moment, this vast cluster of worlds had completely recovered to its peak state. Among them, the small worlds that had fused into this group of worlds had recovered to their original state before they fused together. However, they were no longer as independent as before. At this moment, an invisible barrier appeared between the countless world clusters, which seemed to have separated them one by one. However, this was not enough to deceive the crowd of cultivators. They clearly knew that this was nothing more than an illusion. These barriers were only there to look good, but they had no meaning at all. Their world cluster was still mixed with many other world clusters. It was still a part of this vast, chaotic group of worlds. Knowing this, how could these cultivators be sent away so easily? At this moment, Many cultivators planned to question the middle-aged itinerant cultivator. However, before they could do anything, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator waved his hand again. All the cultivators could not help but be swept away by a powerful force, and were sent into their respective Tao Masters' Path of Communication World Group. They appeared at the center of their respective Tao Masters' Path of Communication World Group, just like where they were before the Tao Masters' Path of Communication World Group had fused together. If you want to transcend, don't disturb me. Following this, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator's voice entered their ears, making them feel a chill in their hearts. Chapter 2275. When the cultivators saw this, they were extremely displeased. They even felt like they had been betrayed. Please search for //I/u// However, unless they wanted to go their separate ways, they could only go along with the middle-aged cultivator's wishes. Moreover, with the middle-aged cultivator's means, he clearly had a way to restrain them and prevent them from threatening him. The middle-aged cultivator didn't pay too much attention to the many cultivators. He knew these cultivators too well, and he clearly knew that these cultivators didn't have the courage to perish together with him. At the very least, they wouldn't have the thought of perishing together with him as long as he didn't go overboard. At this moment, he was only carefully thinking about how to break the barrier that Luo Fan used to restrain him and prevent him from ascending. He was trying his best to grasp the wisps of inspiration that had been generated in his heart over the years. After all, he had been brewing for hundreds of millions of years, and his inspiration had been brewing to a considerable degree. Although these cultivators weren't much of a threat to him, they still represented hidden troubles. Their awakening caused the entire situation to no longer be as leisurely as it was before. It had already faintly formed a subtle pressure on his heart. The pressure turned into motivation, and the appearance of this subtle pressure stimulated the middle-aged cultivator's potential. It only took him a few hundred years to gather all the inspiration and find a specific way to break the shackles that Luo Fan had placed on him. Let's begin. After grasping this, the middle-aged cultivator didn't hesitate at all. He swept his gaze across the many worlds and spoke. As he spoke, the hearts of the cultivators that were separated into their respective worlds trembled, and complicated emotions welled up in their hearts. They were relaxed but also nervous. They were naturally relaxed because the middle-aged cultivator was finally going to fulfill the promise he made back then. They were nervous because they didn't know if the middle-aged cultivator's plan would really succeed. At this moment, the cultivators felt an extremely terrifying suction force acting on their worlds and even their bodies. The suction force was so powerful and terrifying. Under this suction force, they felt an indescribable mysterious power constantly being extracted from their worlds and their bodies. Through some mysterious channel, it was transmitted to a mysterious place and fused with an extremely terrifying entity. At this moment, they vaguely felt that they had fused with all the other cultivators, including the middle-aged cultivator in the center of the countless worlds. All kinds of unfamiliar, familiar, great, or humble thoughts were directly transmitted into their hearts at this moment. A feeling that they had grown by an unknown number of times surfaced in their hearts at this moment. Before they could experience this mysterious and inexplicable feeling, the middle-aged cultivator had already taken action. Countless flames appeared above the many worlds out of nowhere, and like specks of candlelight, they gradually fell into the worlds. The candlelight was extremely weak, but all the cultivators in the many worlds could feel an unimaginable terror from it. It was as if the candlelight was enough to completely erase all of them once it exploded. At this moment, the candlelight directly fell into the worlds and instantly expanded by trillions of times. The originally tiny candlelight turned into a sea of flames. It was a sea of fire that engulfed the entire world cluster. What's going on? Are you trying to silence us? A cultivator shrieked, his voice filled with fear. Then, the cultivators and the disciples of the Tao masters all cried out in alarm and groaned, as if they were all enduring unbearable pain after the flames formed by the candlelight fell into the various worlds. Due to the differences in each group, they underwent earth-shattering changes. The color of the sea of flames also changed accordingly. As a result, the countless sea of flames became colorful, turning the endless world into an unimaginable world of flames. Flames, world group. There were all sorts of strange flames. Almost all the flames that cultivators could imagine and could not imagine were contained within them. Sizzle, 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 crackle, 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 rumble, 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 rumble. All kinds of imaginable and unimaginable terrifying noises were constantly coming from the colorful sea of fire. Shock waves were constantly being transmitted from it, causing earth-shattering changes in the surrounding power of creation and forming all kinds of unimaginable shock waves. Densely packed worlds were densely stacked, and destroyers were born. The scene was so grand that it reached an unimaginable stage. As time passed, the cries of pain, screams, and screams of the cultivators grew weaker and weaker. Vaguely, some cultivators even began to turn the cries of pain into cheers. It was as if they had already sensed the changes that they were looking forward to. Facing such changes, the middle-aged cultivator revealed an inexplicable smile. Then, he withdrew his smile and raised his hands to form seals in the air. Countless complicated hand seals appeared between his hands. Forming hand seals was something that cultivators would only do when they used divine abilities that they could not fully control. Given the middle-aged cultivator's identity as someone who had come from the fifth layer in reverse, the fact that he could not fully control the divine abilities and divine abilities that he could not fully control were clearly something worth looking forward to. Due to his many hand seals, the sound of something extremely sturdy shattering kept ringing out among the many worlds. Every time it broke, boundless power would be released and spread in all directions. Under normal circumstances, the power released due to the rupture should have completely dissipated into the surrounding void or the boundless power of creation. However, due to the middle-aged rogue cultivator's actions, the scattered power did not disperse at all. Instead, it continued to gather under the influence of some kind of supreme power. It gradually crossed the sky and arrived above his head. It continued to accumulate and compress until it gradually turned into an indescribable, auspicious cloud. It was a type of auspicious cloud that was formed from the cultivation realm of ordinary celestial realm cultivators. This change made him look extremely divine, as if he had become extremely extraordinary. However, if his identity and strength were taken into account, then this kind of change was simply as strange as an elderly university student putting on a red scarf and joining the young pioneers. After all, with his identity as an independent cultivator, he had already returned to his original state a long time ago. His control over his strength, cultivation, might, and even everything related to it had reached an unfathomable height. If he didn't want to show any abnormalities, then no living being should be able to see anything unusual about him or see anything special about him. The appearance of this auspicious cloud clearly went against his nature of returning to his natural state. The middle-aged vagrant cultivator looked slightly strained. It seemed that whether it was using the spell or holding the magic cloud, it was not an easy task for him. However, even though it was so difficult, he did not plan to stop. Instead, he continued to form hand seals and unleashed that indescribable god ability, condensing the power brought by the rupture of the worlds into the cloud above his head that was getting bigger and bigger. 2 world clusters, 20 world clusters, 200 world clusters, 2,000 world clusters, 20,000 world clusters. The number of rupturing worlds continued to increase, and the area of the auspicious cloud above his head continued to increase. In just a few hundred breaths of time, the number of worlds that were cracking at the edge had already reached hundreds of billions. The auspicious cloud was affected by this, and its surface area had already reached a size that could not be described with light years. It hovered above the middle-aged cultivator's head. Its area was so vast that even if thousands of worlds were to fill it up, it would only take up a small portion of it. Compared to the auspicious cloud, the middle-aged cultivator's body had shrunk to the point that it was almost non-existent. By now, the middle-aged rogue cultivator's body was trembling non-stop. As for his complexion, it was already extremely pale. The sweat that had disappeared from his body for many years was continuously seeping out of his pores, turning into wisps of smoke that continuously rose into the air. The strenuous look on his face showed that he was putting everything he had on the task. Fortunately, he had the light of the world supporting him like a living creature. Otherwise, he would not have been able to hold on perfectly. At this moment, the sea of flames that enveloped the various worlds had undergone all sorts of indescribable changes. Some of them were gradually extinguishing, while some of them were unprecedentedly vigorous. Even the color of the sea of flames had undergone some changes compared to before. In contrast to the sea of fire, there were also changes to the cultivators in the various worlds. At this moment, the cultivators were both happy and sad. Some were excited, some were angry, some were sad, and some were proud. There were all sorts of different expressions, vividly displaying the various emotions of living beings. There was one thing in common among the cultivators, and that was, those who had positive emotions had the aura of ascension that was at least 10 times stronger than before. It seemed that all they needed to do was to touch a certain switch or cause and effect, and they would be able to ascend and leave the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. They would be able to step into the 5th level of the Tao Master's path, which represented freedom and detachment from all restraints. As for those with negative emotions, the ascending aura did not increase at all. In fact, it had even started to weaken. Among them, the majority of those with positive emotions were from the Tao Sovereign path, and the majority of those with negative emotions were from the independent cultivators. The reason for this change was because the boundless sea of fire was causing great damage to the worlds of the cultivators. At the same time, the connection between the worlds of the cultivators and the other worlds was constantly weakening. In other words, all the worlds were constantly advancing towards freedom, and as a result of this advancement, the ascending aura of the cultivators who had already fulfilled the requirements for ascending became even stronger. As for the cultivators who originally thought that their foundations were sufficient, but in reality were still lacking, the ascending aura of the cultivators became weaker and weaker. The difference in their experiences caused their emotions to be different at this moment. As for the reason for this change, it was because they clearly felt that their foundations were sufficient to ascend, but when it was time to ascend, some cultivators could not meet the requirements at all. The reason was even simpler. Because what they felt before was merely the feeling when many world clusters fused together. As a matter of fact, after the worlds became independent and the environment changed, they had to reconsider the issues that they didn't need to consider during the process of fusion. Naturally, there were flaws in what they thought was perfection, which naturally led to the current difference. As for why the majority of the cultivators under the Tao Sovereign path met the requirements, and the majority of the independent cultivators did not, there was no need to explain. Almost all of the disciples under the Tao Sovereign path had already accumulated enough foundations to ascend. Even if there were flaws in the process of making up for each other, it was not enough to affect their original perfection. Naturally, they would not be unable to ascend because of these flaws. However, it was different for the independent cultivators. Most of them relied on this fusion to make up for their originally lacking foundations. Under such circumstances, the flaws that resulted from independence would naturally have an unimaginable impact on them. It was enough to directly knock them down to the ground and prevent them from ascending. The middle-aged independent cultivator did not have the slightest intention of paying attention to the changes in the emotions of the many cultivators. At this moment, he was so exhausted that he wanted to die. He had already poured all his energy into the auspicious cloud above his head, and with great difficulty, He controlled the ever-growing auspicious cloud to exert force in the direction he wanted. He could sense that there was an indescribable barrier above the auspicious cloud. It was so strong that he could not even be sure if it really existed. It was blocking the only way for him to return to the fifth level of the Tao's sovereign path. Ga. As the auspicious clouds continued to grow, the indistinct barrier seemed to have this kind of sound coming from it. Chapter 2276. Cracks started to form on the barrier. An indescribable excitement welled up in the heart of the middle-aged itinerant cultivator. He was like a drowning person who finally saw the surface of the water above his head and was about to rise to the surface to enjoy the endless fresh air. At this moment, in the center of the vortex, in the center of the world group, Luo Fan's world group suddenly underwent an inexplicable change. In a trance, it was as if a sleeping giant was slowly waking up from its dream. A subtle wriggling began to appear in the many lands, worlds, and spacetimes of the world group. Wisps of strange power began to appear in the many lands, worlds, and spacetimes before gradually converging and condensing. Not long after, the entire world group began to emit an indescribable light. The light was so intense and mysterious. Under the illumination of the light, the world cluster was like a deep black hole, turning into a sun that emitted endless light. This light continued to spread in all directions, enveloping more and more worlds within its range. As they were enveloped by the light, the masters of the world group recalled the terror of being dominated by Luo Fan. Their emotions fluctuated endlessly. Some were panicked, some were surprised, some were angry, some were resentful, and some were even hysterical. Hurry up, they shouted one by one. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator's heart was filled with anxiety. As the ruler of the fourth level of the Tao sovereign path, the things he could sense and understand were naturally much more than other cultivators. For many cultivators, the changes in the central world group only gave them an ominous feeling. Although they felt that something was wrong, they didn't know what exactly was wrong. They didn't know how it would develop if they didn't pay attention to it. However, he could clearly sense that the light was searching for an indescribable existence in the world group. That indescribable existence was an extremely pure existence to any world group. It seemed to contain all the secrets and essence of the world group. Once such existences were plundered, these worlds would no longer have any secrets from the central world cluster, which was the powerhouse who suppressed and dominated them all. At that time, the enemy only needed a single thought, to destroy all the worlds. After losing so many worlds and so many cultivators, no matter how strong the middle-aged loose cultivator was, he had no confidence in taking on Luo Fan. Therefore, to him, the change before his eyes was simply breaking his foundation. How could he not be shocked? However, even though he was shocked, he wasn't surprised by this change. After all, what they had done before, and even what they were doing now, was cutting off a portion of Luo Fan's cultivation resources. No matter what, this kind of change would touch Luo Fan's nerves. It was perfectly normal for him to react accordingly and take corresponding actions. In fact, the fact that he had waited until now to take action was already a pleasant surprise for him. Under such circumstances, even if the world cluster's response was so powerful, why would he be surprised? Open! The middle-aged loose cultivator roared at this moment. As he roared, the boundless power that hovered above his head like a magic cloud suddenly exploded. It seemed like a terrifying power that was tens of thousands of times stronger than before was born, and it spread in all directions. After all, with the middle-aged loose cultivator's current strength, it was already quite difficult for him to push the magic cloud and make it break through the barrier that was trapping him and preventing him from returning to the fifth level. Under such circumstances, how could he perfectly control the power of the explosion that was tens of thousands of times greater than the original power? That was why there was such a phenomenon. His target was clearly above him, but the power generated by the explosion was sweeping in all directions. Of course, he was a middle-aged rogue cultivator after all. His detonation technique was naturally quite exquisite and mysterious. In this kind of explosion, a large portion of the power still flew upwards under his adjustment, directly colliding with the barrier. The boundless void around him suddenly collapsed under the impact of this impact. Boundless heaven and earth, worlds, and time and space changed wildly before being destroyed at an unimaginable speed. Countless living beings screamed in pain during this process. There was even a boundless, baleful aura that kept surging and accumulating in the surroundings. However, it was crushed by the terrifying impact and eventually turned into nothingness. The shock waves kept surging in all directions, crashing into the worlds in the distance. Although the power of the impact waves had been greatly reduced after traveling such a long distance, the moment the impact waves crashed into the world clusters, at least half of them were crushed. However, the instant the impact waves crashed into the world clusters, at least half of them were crushed. Some unlucky ones happened to be in the direction where the impact waves were concentrated. The entire world clusters were completely wiped out, and not a single trace of them was left. Facing such a change, whether it was the middle-aged loose cultivator or the cultivators that weren't directly affected by the impact waves, none of them had the mind to care. After all, the current situation was clearly that a terrifying change was about to occur. Perhaps all of them would fall into a desperate situation. Under such circumstances, how big of a heart would one have to have the mind to care about what happened to others? Although the terrifying impact caused by the detonation of the power was not concentrated, the power generated when it crashed into the barrier was still tens of thousands of times stronger than before. When such a terrifying force collided with the barrier, which was already filled with tiny cracks, suddenly crumbled under the impact. It finally opened. An indescribable joy flashed in the middle-aged loose cultivator's eyes. He no longer cared about anything else. His body braved the terrifying impact produced by the explosion of the power and charged straight up. In the blink of an eye, he had already rushed through the gap created by the collapse of the barrier. In the process, he wasn't completely immune to the destructive power produced by the explosion of the power. As he passed through the impact, his body suffered great injuries. After passing through the impact, his body had become extremely tattered. His entire body was filled with countless cracks, and even half of his body had turned into dust. It was only because of his powerful willpower that he managed to gather his body together that he did not collapse. However, the middle-aged loose cultivator didn't seem to care about his injuries at all. Instead, he laughed out loud, and his body became more and more illusory. Apart from the traction force that descended from the sky, it seemed like he was ascending. Just as he was about to disappear completely, his eyes suddenly lit up. An indescribably wonderful light appeared in front of him. "What's this?" A thought flashed across his mind. Could it be that I've accidentally entered someone's cultivation dojo? The wonderful light in front of him couldn't be described with words. Its color seemed to contain all the colors in the universe, yet it also seemed like none of the colors in the universe were included in the light. More importantly, this radiance possessed an absolute vitality. Being enveloped by this light, he felt as if he was being enveloped by an incomparably vast and terrifying existence that could destroy him if it leaked out even the slightest bit of its power. The uneasiness, terror, humbleness, and insignificance he felt were all telling him that if he didn't escape from the light, it would be his doomsday in the next moment. Under such a feeling, he began to activate the light of heaven and earth in his body to resist the indescribable light that seemed to be alive. He randomly picked a direction and quickly shot out. However, at this moment, an indescribable feeling emerged from the bottom of his heart. It was an indescribable premonition of danger. It was as if he had become an incomparably fragile baby facing a dozen ferocious tigers at this moment. "What's going on?" This feeling seems to be the power of the Tao Master's prison. As soon as he realized what was going on, his body suddenly trembled. He was already enveloped by a power that he was extremely afraid of. The light and shadow around him gradually changed, as if to send him to a place that he was extremely repulsed by. It was indeed the power of the Tao Master's prison that he had just thought of. Haven't I returned to the 5th level? The middle-aged individual cultivator was, after all, an expert from the 5th level. He was extremely quick-witted, so he instantly understood what was going on. He tried his best to look in all directions. Indistinctly, he could vaguely see a rather familiar structure behind the light. A huge vortex, like a nebula, was suspended in the boundless darkness. Although the vortex was extremely distorted, he could still recognize that it was the vortex in the center of the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. At this point, how could he not understand that he had been tricked? I didn't expect that he would actually be able to condense the light of heaven and earth in the 4th level. As expected of a powerful existence that can easily suppress all existences. The middle-aged individual cultivator smiled bitterly. The indescribable light that enveloped him was obviously the light of heaven and earth. In the 4th level, apart from some cultivators from the 5th level of the Tao Master's path, only the expert who had previously dominated them could control the light of heaven and earth. In this way, the source of the light of heaven and earth that had enveloped him just now was obviously obvious. He had not thought of this before. In the light of heaven and earth, he had actually used the light of heaven and earth that he had brought back from the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. It was only natural that he would attract the power of the Tao Master's prison. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure appeared in front of him. "Thank you for helping me get rid of those burdens," Luo Fan said to the middle-aged individual cultivator. "If you really want to thank me, why don't you let me go?" The middle-aged loose cultivator quickly said. Although his figure was about to be pulled into the Tao Master's prison by the power of the Tao Master's prison. However, to existences of their level, no matter how short a period of time was, they could spend it as if it was a long time. Taking advantage of this opportunity to talk was really nothing. "That won't do. Although you did help me in the end, and allowed me to regain my purity. But the motive of your actions is resistance. This kind of behavior is not worth advocating." Luo Fan only shook his head. Hearing those words, the middle-aged cultivator sighed and did not speak further. His figure gradually disappeared from the 4th level of the Tao Sovereign path, along with the power of the Tao Sovereign prison. After he disappeared, Luo Fan's figure finally appeared. However, he was no longer within the light. Instead, he was outside the light, standing right above the whirlpool. If he lowered his head slightly, he would be able to see the entire whirlpool. Right now, there was an extremely tiny ball of light floating above his head. It was only the size of a fist, but it was extremely mysterious and wondrous. Its color could not be described with words at all. In fact, it was a light that could not even be described with words. If one had to use an adjective to describe this light, it would be as if it was alive. It was none other than the light of heaven and earth that he had condensed. In fact, the middle-aged loose cultivator's previous speculation about him was somewhat correct, but also completely wrong. What was correct was that he had indeed fallen into an indescribable state after the light of heaven and earth and the power extracted from the general trend were annihilated, and he did not have the mood to care about them. What was wrong was that he was not ignorant during the process, but his mind was still clear. He had seen all the plans that the middle-aged loose cultivator and the other cultivators had made, and all the methods that they had used. For Luo Fan, as long as he saw it, even if he did not have the time or energy to deal with them, he would definitely have countless ways to disrupt their plans. Since he did not interfere during the process, there was obviously only one possibility. That was, all these changes were the result of his tacit approval. Chapter 2277. At this moment, the time period that appeared in Luo Fan's heart was none other than the time when his next great tribulation was about to descend. Evidently, when his light of the heavens and earth had become complete, the will that originally existed within it had finally broken through the boundary and turned into the true will of the heavens and earth, and he had also obtained great benefits from it. His cultivation realm had greatly improved, and he had finally reached the level where he could sense the sixth great tribulation that belonged to him. 3 trillion years might seem like an extremely long period of time, but compared to the time when he could not sense it at all, it was already a huge leap. Moreover, the time when his great tribulation would descend was closely related to his cultivation realm. As long as his cultivation realm continued to improve, the time period would continue to shorten. If Luo Fan's methods were brilliant and his cultivation realm increased fast enough, it was not impossible for him to shorten the time period to a few days. Of course, this was only in theory. If he wanted to shorten the great calamity that would descend in trillions of years to just a few days later, then the amount of improvement needed was enough to make all cultivators despair. Even Luo Fan would find it almost impossible to accomplish this. At this moment, under the power of the Tao Master's prison, the middle-aged unaffiliated cultivator from the 5th level of the Tao Master's path gradually disappeared. In the blink of an eye, it was as if he had never existed in the 4th level. Although the middle-aged unaffiliated cultivator had been sealed in the Tao Master's prison, the consequences that he had caused did not disappear. Inside the vortex, the many worlds that had fused together were still collapsing and breaking away, gradually regaining the independence that they had lost for a long time. As those worlds broke away, the massive vortex also began to collapse at the same time. The boundless creation power that was originally condensed by the vortex began to turn into strands that constantly dissipated in all directions. The concentration of the creation power was simply too high. Even the strands that dissipated contained an unimaginably terrifying power. Under its impact, the surrounding creation power became chaotic, and all sorts of strange shadows, powers, and spacetime appeared. The scene was astonishing, and the changes were so astonishing that even Luo Fan had to pay attention. The vortex collapsed faster and faster, and the amount of creation power that dissipated from it also increased, causing the surrounding chaos to grow stronger. At first, it was still possible to see which creation power was the cause of the chaos. But as time passed, as the chaos became more and more intense, the source was gradually covered by the chaos. At a glance, there was only endless chaos that was constantly stacking around the vortex, accumulating, and constantly spreading in all directions. The volume that the vortex originally occupied was already quite astonishing, and it could even be said to be a fraction of the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path. Without any restrictions, the chaos that was produced from his body quickly spread to the areas that were not affected by the vortexes. Unknowingly, the entire 4th level of the Tao Sovereign's road had already fallen into an astonishing chaos. In this indescribable chaos, even the existence of the creation power could not be seen. If a cultivator who had ascended at this time came into contact with this scene for the first time, he might directly think that the 4th level of the Tao Master's path was the endless chaotic light and shadows. At this time, where Luo Fan was, he was also affected by the chaos. However, as an expert who could already sense his 6th major tribulation, his essence had long surpassed the 4th level. He didn't even need to take any action. Just his existence alone contained a powerful suppressive force, suppressing all the chaos around him. It didn't affect his body at all, and it couldn't even shake the stability of his aura. At a glance, the area several miles around him was like the most special area in the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path. It was a special area that was independent from the outside world and completely unaffected by any changes in the outside world. In this chaos, from the huge vortex, the clusters of worlds, like leaves being washed away by the waves, were constantly rushed out of the vortex, accompanied by endless chaos, and rushed straight to the corners of the fourth layer of the Tao Master's path. It looked like a pile of spring water had been brought to various parts of the pool. In the process, those world clusters had also suffered a shocking impact. Many world clusters couldn't bear the erosion of the chaos. Every single world, and every single spacetime was constantly being broken and destroyed. Countless fragments were constantly being separated and fused with the surrounding chaos. This change caused the world group to constantly shrink as it flowed. To the masters of the Cosmos group, this kind of damage was like a blunt knife cutting into their flesh, causing the cultivators to wail and cry out in pain. Their voices were so mournful that it would make anyone who heard them weep. What's going on? Why has the creation power become so chaotic? These cultivators were shocked and bewildered, all of them roaring and wailing. It should be known that they were so happy when they sensed that their own world group had been separated from the overall chaotic world group, and they were so looking forward to it. They even had the feeling that once they were separated from the chaotic world group, they would be able to leap freely in the vast sea and fly freely in the sky. But they did not expect that after they were separated from the chaotic world group, what awaited them was such despair and pain. Their own world group was constantly being cut and taken away. It was simply like their past was constantly being cut and taken away. The pain was secondary. The most important thing was the feeling of loss, the terrifying pain of constantly losing one's self. In this pain, whether it was the cultivators who had fully activated their foundation and could trigger the ascension process with just a thought, or the cultivators who could not really trigger the ascension process, at this time, they could only wholeheartedly resist the chaos in the outside world and work hard to protect the integrity of their own world group. None of them had the chance to truly ascend, and since they did not choose to ascend immediately, it was obviously impossible for them to ascend in a short period of time. If they wanted to ascend to the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, they needed to completely refine their own world group and completely integrate into the power extracted from the world group. If the world group itself was already destroyed and many worlds, and spacetime became incomplete, how could they meet the requirements for ascension? Although the vortex was huge and the chaos it stirred was also extremely shocking, it was after all limited. The entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path itself could not be changed at will. Therefore, in Luo Fan's eyes, the chaos caused by the collapse of the vortex had gradually subsided in just a few years. Of course, this was only in Luo Fan's eyes. Because of the nature of the creation energy, the length of time was also different for different places where the creation energy was located. In other words, for many cultivators immersed in the endless chaos, time was different. Some cultivators were lucky and only felt that a few hundred years had passed. But for some other cultivators, this period of time had already increased to the level of billions of years. There was even a Tao Master's disciple who was so unlucky that he even felt that the chaos had lasted for thousands of trillion years. And the longer the time that the cultivators sensed, the greater the damage they suffered in the chaos. Those who were lucky only lost thousands of worlds, and spacetime. For those who were unlucky, 70 to 80% of the worlds, and spacetime had already disappeared in the endless creation energy that was gradually calming down. And the cultivator who lost so many worlds, and spacetime had also lost the corresponding past. Although he had not completely turned into a living dead, he had already become a blank person with amnesia. He could only rely on his instincts to protect his world group, and even seek an extremely small chance of restoring his world group. Compared to the previous changes, the disciples of the Taoist master had a great advantage. This time, the completely random changes in the chaos ignored the difference in cultivation realms, and ignored the difference in status. There was almost no difference between the Tao Master's disciples and the rogue cultivators. In other words, among the cultivators who suffered great losses, The proportion of the Tao Master's disciples was not much less than the rogue cultivators. And among the cultivators who were lucky and did not suffer great losses, the proportion of rogue cultivators was not much less than the Tao Master's disciples. This could be said to be an unprecedented fairness in the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. And among the endless broken worlds, there was a world that stood out like a crane among chickens. It stood at the center of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, emitting endless light like the sun, enveloping the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, providing unprecedented light to all the worlds within. This world group was naturally Luo Fan's world group. This world group that existed at the center of the vortex should have suffered the greatest impact when the vortex collapsed. After all the creation energy in the vortex was deeply connected to this world group. Under this connection, the collapse and flow of the creation energy would naturally be transmitted to the world group, which was equivalent to tearing it apart again and again, but in the end, all of this did not leave a single trace on the world group. This group of worlds did not suffer any damage because of this. On the contrary, during this process, it expanded by nearly 100 times. Although the area it covered was insignificant compared to the vast area covered by the vortex, it was enough to stun all cultivators and make them feel inferior. Looks like everything is going well. An inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he floated above his own world group. At this moment, above his head, the light of heaven and earth formed a small but constantly distorted shadow of light, constantly changing its shape, its characteristics, and even its essence. The shadow's changes were extremely complicated. During the process, it seemed to be evolving all sorts of mysteries that even Luo Fan could not understand. This was the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan had condensed. It already contained the complete and genuine will of the world. Although this light of heaven and earth was many times smaller than the light of heaven and earth from the middle-aged cultivator and senior sister May, its power was not something that any of them could compare to. It could even be said that this light of heaven and earth was completely different from their light of heaven and earth. Even comparing them together would be an insult to Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. At this moment, Luo Fan's mind was constantly connected to the world will in the light of heaven and earth. Everything that happened to the light of heaven and earth, and the changes caused by the world will in the light of heaven and earth were constantly connected to his mind, allowing him to clearly sense them. However, even though he had condensed the light of heaven and earth and nurtured the world will in it, he still could not understand the world will at all. All the details of the world will's thoughts and changes were clearly displayed in his senses. In fact, it was as if his other mind was undergoing various changes. However, he could not keep up with these changes no matter what, nor could he understand the meaning of these details. It was as if he was just an ant that was trying his best to understand the thinking process of a massive existence that used a planet as its thought node. For example, the thoughts that the will of the world was carrying out right now were instinctive to it. It could not even be subdivided into some changes, connections, and things that could only be described with common sense. However, even if Luo Fan used all of his wisdom and spent countless years to deduce them, he still wouldn't be able to deduce them. These details filled the entire thought process of the world will. They filled every question it thought about, and filled every feeling it had towards the outside world. Chapter 2278. Even if he could not understand the will of heaven and earth inside the light of heaven and earth, just sensing the many details and changes in it had already made Luo Fan receive an indescribable edification. His cultivation realm was improving subtly every moment, and his worldview was becoming more and more perfect in the process. This was like an ordinary person standing next to a moral model. Even if he did not understand the thoughts behind the moral model's every move, as long as he got along with it for a long time, he would naturally be influenced, and his every move would naturally be similar to that of the moral model. Of course, it was only close. Without the corresponding belief, without understanding the support behind the actions of the moral role model, without taking it as one's own belief, one's own support, it would be impossible to completely become the moral role model. This was just like Luo Fan at this time. He could receive the edification of the will of heaven and earth, and he could unknowingly absorb the subtle existence that was beneficial to his improvement. However, in the case that he could not understand the will of heaven and earth, no matter how much edification he received, no matter how long he perceived the will of heaven and earth, it was impossible for him to fully understand the will of heaven and earth, and obtain all its mysteries. This was a limitation of the life level, and it was a limitation that could not be surpassed. At this time, Luo Fan was not surprised by this limitation, nor did he feel disappointed because of it. On the contrary, he was extremely pleased to enjoy the wonderful feeling of being unable to understand the operation of the will of heaven and earth, and he was comprehending the wonderful perspective of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path through this feeling. At this time, through the light of heaven and earth, he saw the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path was no longer what it originally looked like. It was no longer the endless power of creation that filled every inch of the void, but it had turned into a more mysterious, more complex, and clearer appearance. Looking at the endless power of creation through the light of heaven and earth, it was unknown how many types and layers there were. There were the assimilation of cultivators, the derivation of worlds, the creation of living beings, the concealment and rejection. There were all kinds of characteristics of the power of creation, which were originally vague and difficult to distinguish, but at this time, in his eyes, they were as clear as the colors on a painting. He casually made a grabbing motion, and as the Genesis energy surged, countless space-time appeared in his hand. No one knew how many creatures were born from the space-time that he had created. These space-times existed within the power of creation. While they were constantly nourished by the power of creation, they also endured the powerful pressure of the power of creation. The two contradictory effects appeared on the space-time at the same time, causing the space-time to fall into an indescribable dynamic equilibrium. Vaguely, there seemed to be countless faintly discernible rivers of time behind these space-times. They seemed to be the source of these space-times, and also seemed to be the destination of these space-times. Its profundity could not be described with words. However, for Luo Fan, it was obvious at a glance. At this moment, he had already seen all the hidden details of this space-time clearly. The rivers of time behind these space-times were the endless Genesis energy around them. They were the rivers of time that existed for all the cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Now, it seemed that the creation power was searching for the source of the spacetime. In other words, it was comparing it to the endless spacetime in the endless river of time, searching for a corresponding spacetime to connect it to the creation power. Once the connection was successful, then these spacetimes would naturally have a close connection with the cultivator represented by the river of time, as if they were grabbed from the river of time. It was even enough for people to control a part of the cultivator's will through this spacetime. Of course, this situation was almost impossible. After all, this spacetime was born from Luo Fan's random changes to the Genesis energy, and all the details were randomly generated. Under such circumstances, wanting to find the same spacetime in the endless river of time was simply like looking for a creature that was exactly the same as oneself in the vast universe. It was an almost impossible task. It was precisely because of this that the river of time behind this spacetime would constantly appear and change at this moment, but it was not stable. It could be imagined that once Luo Fan's will that maintained these spacetimes dissipated, these spacetimes would naturally collapse due to the drastic changes, die, and eventually disappear without a trace, as if they had never existed. If I really want to change the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, perhaps I can do this. With a slight thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed to the void. In an instant, a subtle fluctuation flew out from his finger and began to frantically spread in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept through every position on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, causing every bit of Genesis energy in the entire fourth level to be affected and changed by this fluctuation. As the fluctuation swept through the entire fourth level, all the Genesis energy was stuck and produced a strange tremor. In this tremor, the incomparably complex and mysterious structure inside began to produce subtle changes. An indescribable power began to be released from the power of creation. Under this power, long rivers appeared out of thin air between the endless Genesis energy of the fourth level, stretching across the highest point of view. In other words, any living being, no matter where they were, could only see these long rivers when they looked up. After they appeared, there was a loud crashing sound that resounded through the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, among the many worlds that were originally scattered by the impact of the Genesis energy, the cultivators, whether they were under the Tao Master's path or rogue cultivators, could not help but be attracted by this sound. They naturally raised their heads and looked towards the source of the sound. The long rivers were instantly imprinted in their eyes. This is... The cultivators, whether they were awake or confused, whether they were clear-minded or a living dead, could not help but secretly tremble. The long rivers were grand and vast, and the aura of time that they emitted was so strong that they seemed to be able to see the endless years that flowed from the beginning of time to the infinitely distant future. The river of time. Inexplicable sighs of surprise suddenly came from the various worlds, answering their previous doubts. Whether they were awake or confused, whether they were clear-minded or a living dead, they were soon attracted by the long rivers that they were most familiar with in the river of time. In a trance, they seemed to have seen their own history. They saw everything they had experienced since birth, every touch, and every encounter they had. This is my river of time. For a moment, they almost simultaneously realized the nature of the long rivers, and their hearts were filled with shock and panic. His river of time was now exposed to the world without any concealment. If someone was curious, wouldn't they be able to see all his secrets from it? After realizing this, they instinctively wanted to hide the long rivers. As they realized the nature of the long rivers suddenly trembled, and their originally extremely natural flow suddenly changed from their original state of flowing freely to a divine dragon that had awakened from its deepest slumber. They suddenly broke away from the flow of the countless long rivers, changed direction, and rushed straight down from above, heading straight for the owner of the long rivers. In the power of creation, time was only one of its basic attributes. Under such circumstances, it was naturally meaningless to describe the time that it experienced. Before the cultivators could react, the long rivers of time had already penetrated their worlds and penetrated their bodies. Their back? The cultivators were confused and delighted. However, they soon realized that something was amiss. Although the long rivers of time rushed into their worlds and into their bodies, they didn't return to the abstract level as they had expected. Instead, they turned around and rushed out of their bodies, colliding and reverberating between the worlds, and didn't show any signs of disappearing. The cultivators were shocked at first, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to completely hide the long rivers of time that belonged to them. However, they soon discovered a fact that was enough to make them overjoyed. That was, as the river of time surged in their cosmos group, it was slowly and autonomously opening up pieces of spacetime, worlds, and heavens and earths in their cosmos group, making up for the missing heavens and earths, worlds, and spacetime in their cosmos group. This change allowed the cultivators who suffered the most damage to the worlds to reap the benefits first. Their living dead appearance gradually disappeared, and their dead eyes gradually gained some intelligence. As the long rivers of time surged through their worlds, they naturally made up for the damage their worlds had suffered, and their memories were naturally restored, allowing them to gradually recover their thoughts. After sensing this benefit, it was clear what the cultivators should do. They immediately began to cooperate with the long rivers of time, guiding the long rivers of time into the most perfect and extensive wanderings in their own worlds. In other words, according to the time sequence of the birth of space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth, they began to wander in a wandering manner that connected every heaven and earth, every world, and every piece of space-time. In this way, their worlds gradually stabilized. It looked like a plate of scattered pearls were completely strung together by a thread, forming a winding necklace. Tens of thousands of years passed in the blink of an eye as the cultivators sensed the passage of time. After tens of thousands of years, even the cultivators who suffered the most damage in their original worlds had completely recovered. Their memories, their spirits, and their thoughts were completely restored, and they were completely at their peak state. Of course, the various refinements of the world group and the degree of integration with the power extracted from the world group had naturally disappeared. The feeling of ascension that existed in them when they were in a state of fusion also disappeared without a trace. This was also a matter of course. Most of the worlds, and space-time in this world group had just been created and were in the most primitive state. It was already rare for them to be able to maintain complete control of these worlds, and space-time. How could they still hope to integrate with the power of the world group? After regaining their ability to think, the cultivators gradually realized, this is the benefit he's giving us. For a time, complicated gazes were cast from all directions on the world group that looked like the sun in the center of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path looked no different from the beginning. It was still endlessly pitch black, dotted with star-like worlds. However, as long as one took a closer look, they would find that compared to the beginning, the fourth level had undergone earth-shaking changes. For example, in the world group that was dotted with stars, countless worlds, and space-time were no longer in a discrete state as before. Instead, they were connected by a long river that exuded a boundless aura of time. It seemed to be completely illusory, but had an extraordinary sense of existence. The beginning and end of this long river were all in the cultivator, who was either a Tao Master's disciple or a rogue cultivator. It was the same for all the other world groups except for Luo Fan's world group. Of course, this did not mean that Luo Fan's world group remained the same as before. On the contrary, at this moment, Luo Fan's world group was actually the world group that had changed the most among all the world groups on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The other world groups just had an additional long river of time that connected heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time together. Luo Fan's world group already had an indescribable, living light that shrouded the entire world group. The light looked like a cloud that enveloped the entire world cluster. It made the entire world cluster look like a mosquito wrapped in resin, and together with the light, it turned into an incomparably huge amber. This light was none other than the light of heaven and earth condensed by Luo Fan. Chapter 2279. The way Luo Fan's entire group of worlds operated within the light of the universe was much more intricate and mysterious than before. If the way it operated before was like pieces of flesh and bones arranged according to their size, then the way it operated now was like the countless pieces of flesh and bones had fused into a complete creature, or even a human with extremely high intelligence. The two seemed to be using the same materials, but the difference was self-evident. Obviously, it was none other than the light of the heavens and the earth condensed by Luo Fan that had the effect of connecting the heavens and the earth, the world, and the space here. Although the light of the universe was extremely small and could even be said to be extremely weak, the will of the world within it was not weakened at all. It was the true and complete will of the world. Compared to the will of a living being like Luo Fan, this existence was more than 10 million times stronger. Using this will to control the world, worlds, and space-time within the group of worlds, it was only natural that it could achieve such an effect that far surpassed what Luo Fan could do. At this moment, Luo Fan floated above the group of worlds. He sat with his legs crossed and looked relaxed. Endless information flowed through his mind. Countless mysteries that belonged to the world group and the mysteries of the light of the heavens and earth continuously appeared in his mind. They were gradually transformed and absorbed by him, and in the end, they became his foundation and resources for his growth. As he continued to absorb the endless mysteries and principles, he faintly felt that his cultivation level seemed to be wriggling bit by bit. What he sensed was that the sixth great tribulation was about to descend was also getting closer and closer with each passing year due to this change. Now, compared to the huge number of 3 trillion years, the decrease in the number seemed insignificant. It was not even enough to cause a change in the number, but it was only temporary. As time passed, the decrease would definitely shake the number, causing a considerable decrease in the number. At this moment, many cultivators had an inexplicable and complicated feeling towards Luo Fan. Some were grateful, some were hateful, some were desperate, and some were fearful. There were all kinds of emotions that could be produced by living beings. Evidently, the torture that Luo Fan had inflicted on them had left a deep mark on their souls. Seeing that Luo Fan didn't seem to be in the mood to pay attention to them, they couldn't help but feel a little relieved. Previously, he was wholeheartedly trying to create all sorts of situations to merge our worlds. Why is he not doing anything to stop us now that we've exhausted all of our means to destroy this chaos? This question appeared in the minds of many cultivators. However, this was only in their hearts. None of them even dared to raise this question at this moment. If they were to break this harmonious and silent atmosphere, perhaps Luo Fan would suddenly explode and directly attack them. Although this possibility was extremely small, as long as there was a possibility, they obviously did not dare to take the risk. No matter how much they thought about it, their realm was not high enough. In the end, they could not understand Luo Fan's considerations. For Luo Fan, their worlds were merely a catalyst. It was a catalyst to increase his foundation and allow him to receive the river of time. Back then, he had tried his best to create a situation where their worlds were mixed together and became a part of his world. That was because it was the only way to receive their river of time. And now, he had already received the various potentials, foundations, and other indescribable existences from the river of time. As such, there was no longer a need for their cosmos clusters. In fact, because he no longer needed their worlds, the countless worlds that had merged with his world had instead become a burden and impurities. In this way, even if the many cultivators did not use all of their means to break this chaos and separate their worlds from Luo Fan's world, Luo Fan would have taken the initiative to do this after he recovered. It could be said that from a certain point of view, the previous actions of these cultivators actually saved Luo Fan a lot of effort, allowing him to start a new round of cultivation more quickly. Under such circumstances, at this time, Luo Fan naturally did not have any intention to stop or punish these cultivators. At this time, the many cultivators did not understand the mystery behind this at all, but this did not affect them from starting the next step of cultivation. For them, it was a disaster that their worlds were mixed and they were imprisoned. However, after escaping, they reflected on their previous experiences and suddenly found that it could be regarded as a kind of training. At this moment, the gradually calming cultivators began to feel all kinds of indescribable enlightenment began to emerge from the bottom of their hearts. Their understanding of the world group, their understanding of cultivation, their understanding of the river of time, and even their understanding of the power of creation and the fourth level of the Tao Master's path began to rapidly deepen. The entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path began to gradually fall into an indescribable cultivation atmosphere with this change. The strange and dangerous atmosphere that was originally composed of various emotions also slowly dissipated without anyone noticing. Time passed minute by minute and second by second. Unknowingly, millions of years had passed. On this day, something that had not happened in the fourth level for hundreds of millions of years finally happened again. An indescribable brilliance was born from somewhere in the fourth level and began to spread in all directions. In the end, it spread to every corner of the fourth level and attracted the attention of almost all cultivators. Countless eyes from all directions looked towards the source of the brilliance. This is ascension? Some cultivators murmured with envy and some pity in their eyes. They were envious that the ascended cultivators would soon be able to touch more profound and complex mysteries of cultivation. Perhaps their cultivation realms would be able to grow more easily and their strength would also be able to improve more easily. However, it was a pity that if they left just like that, they would miss out on many mysteries that they had just comprehended in the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. It must be said that ever since the River of Time appeared in the fourth level and connected their world group 1,000,000 years ago, they were able to comprehend new things almost every moment. They could feel that there was a connection between the River of Time and the power of creation that they could comprehend for countless years. Even after comprehending for 1,000,000 years, even the cultivators who improved the fastest would only be at the beginning of this aspect and could only barely hide the River of Time. Under such circumstances, it was naturally a pity to abandon everything and ascend. However, although they all had complicated emotions, none of them spoke up to interrupt the ascension of the cultivator at this moment. Those who could cultivate to this level were naturally not fools. Since they had made such a decision, they had naturally considered everything clearly and no one else had the right to say anything. After the brilliance swept across the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, it began to quickly retract. In the blink of an eye, it had already returned to his body and completely seeped into his body. Immediately afterwards, the vast world group around his body began to rapidly melt and gradually turned into an indescribable power. It followed the path of the brilliance and seeped into his body. In the blink of an eye, it had disappeared without a trace, as if there had never been such a world group on the fourth level. At this moment, many cultivators finally saw what kind of existence the ascended cultivator was. He was a disciple of a Tao Master who looked to be only 12 or 13 years old at this moment. He had a dignified appearance and a transcendental charm lingered around him. From the void above, there was a ray of light that shone down and enveloped him. Because the world group had already disappeared, he was now directly facing the endless power of creation around him. However, the endless power of creation seemed so obedient before him. It did not seem like it was facing ordinary cultivators that tried to corrode him. Instead, it was like a mouse that had seen a cat, trying its best to avoid his body. It was as if he was in an abyss or a black hole. Immediately afterwards, he let out a long roar and said, "Everyone, take care. I'm leaving." As he spoke, he charged up and disappeared into the void along with the light, disappearing from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The entire process was so straightforward that the surrounding cultivators could not react to it. Is this ascension? Why does it look like he's escaping? Some cultivators murmured with disbelief. It would be fine if it was just the way he disappeared. Although it was a little rushed, it was still just a rush, so they would not think too much about it. However, with the words, "take care," it seemed a little special. Could it be that he sensed danger? A more sensitive cultivator said worriedly at this moment. There were countless cultivators, and the paths of cultivation were innumerable. Under such circumstances, it was very normal for some cultivators to be able to sense things that ordinary cultivators couldn't. They wouldn't be surprised if a cultivator discovered some danger that they couldn't sense in the future. At that moment, many cultivators had the thought of immediately ascending and leaving the fourth level. They withdrew their gazes and began to change their original direction of cultivation. From the direction of comprehending the mysteries of the connection between the river of time and the power of creation that they had come into contact with in the fourth level, they switched to refining their own clusters of worlds, completely fusing with their powers and meeting the requirements of ascending. Of course, there were not many cultivators like this. After all, even if they had been traumatized by Luofan, they definitely did not lack their own opinions since they could make it this far. Before seeing real evidence, most cultivators would not so easily make a decision that would affect their direction of cultivation just because of a guess. At this moment, they were only discussing the possibility of danger and asking each other if there was any evidence to support their guess. In the end, when everyone denied it, they gradually dispersed and began to resume their original cultivation. However, the atmosphere had changed after all. In the next million years, almost every few years, there would be cultivators who completely fused with the power of the world group and fulfilled the requirements of ascending to the fourth level. They directly ascended out of the fourth level and stepped into the more wonderful and mysterious fifth level that they were looking forward to. In the beginning, there were still cultivators who would pay attention and be curious about the various subtle and mysterious mysteries of this ascension. However, after a few times, even the most curious cultivators lost their sense of novelty and could not be bothered to pay attention to the process of ascension anymore. Unless the person who ascended was someone that they were acquainted with, they would only pay attention to it out of politeness as a form of farewell. Every ascending cultivator behaved rather strangely at the last moment. At first, they seemed to be rather relaxed, but the more time passed, the more urgent they became. In the end, after completing all the ascending procedures, they would ascend out of the fourth level like the first ascending cultivator. Before leaving, they would all leave behind warnings such as "take care of yourselves." It was as if they wanted to tell everyone something, but they could not say it due to some restrictions. This kind of behavior also only attracted the attention of other cultivators at the beginning. After a few times, they gradually became accustomed to it, just like how cultivators ascended. One day, a cultivator who was about to ascend had a look of extreme terror on his face. He yelled, "Senior Marshal Brothers, hurry up and ascend! Hurry up! Otherwise it'll be too late!" As he roared, his body seemed to be enduring unimaginable pressure. All sorts of terrifying explosions continuously occurred within his body, and the loud booms sounded as if his body was being compressed into countless terrifying bombs. In the blink of an eye, more than half of his body had been turned into minced meat and turned into powder. However, even so, his body continued to ascend towards the next level. At this moment, figures appeared out of thin air at the place where the cultivator was ascending. They looked panicked and one of them shouted, "Junior brother, what did you see? What danger is there?" At this moment, all the cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path could not help but look over from all directions, and all of them were inexplicably shocked. This cultivator's behavior really caught their attention. Chapter 2280. The cultivators who were watching this were all dumbfounded, and their hearts were in turmoil. "Junior brother, where are you? How are you now?" At this moment, the senior brother and the others who had just ascended started to cry out. Obviously, the way that Ascender disappeared in the end made them feel extremely worried. They were worried that their junior brother was still alive. However, it was obvious that whether their junior brother had ascended normally or had been erased. At this time, it was impossible to give them any response. Therefore, no matter what, their cries were in vain. After a while, these cultivators finally came to their senses. Although the nervousness and worry on their faces did not change, at least they did not continue to cry out, "I want to ascend." Among them, an old man immediately said. Hearing this, a few others looked solemn and said, "Let's go together. It would be best if you ascended, but if you were erased, let's see what exactly erased junior brother." Hearing everyone's resolute and decisive words, the old man who spoke first wanted to stop them, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything. He sighed and said, "All right, then let's work together and ascend together." They were extremely close senior brother and junior brother, and their friendship was even deeper than that of ordinary close relative. Their hearts were completely connected, and their understanding of each other had naturally reached an unimaginable depth. It was difficult for other cultivators to choose to ascend together, and it was even almost impossible, but for them, choosing to ascend together was just a matter of whether they wanted to or not. At this time, after they had reached an agreement, they split up and headed in different directions on the fourth floor of the Tao Master's path, towards the scattered world clusters. Even though they had a close relationship, the position of the world group wasn't decided by them. Instead, it was decided by the impact of the explosion of the vortex when they broke away from it. Obviously, the impact did not take into account the relationship between them, therefore, at this time, if they wanted to return to their own world clusters, they naturally could only go in different directions. Just then, a ray of light of ascension radiated from somewhere and began to spread in all directions. It directly swept through the entire fourth layer of the Tao Master's path and shrouded the entire fourth layer in that inexplicable light. Seeing this, the faces of the junior brothers and junior brothers changed slightly. Their telepathic thoughts made them make a decision at the same time. One by one, they turned around and flew toward the direction where the light came from. In an instant, they arrived at the source of the light, which was outside the average-sized world cluster. At that moment, the owner of the world group was rapidly refining the world group, turning it into an indescribable might that was continuously fusing into his body. Looking at the cultivator's appearance, the faces of the other disciples turned ugly. They clearly knew this cultivator. He was the one who had watched their junior brother's ascension and had a huge reaction. Obviously, this cultivator had heeded their junior brother's warning and chosen to ascend after learning from their junior brother's experience. This was human nature, but seeing the cultivator's choice, they recalled what their junior brother had encountered at the last moment. How could they remain calm when they didn't know if he was going to survive or not? The speed of ascension was relatively fast. Very soon, the cultivator had completely refined his world group and turned it into the power of the world group. He gradually flew toward the end of the light that descended from the sky. At this moment, a cultivator asked loudly, "What did you see?" The cultivator who asked the question was not one of the junior brothers and junior brothers, but another cultivator who had also sensed that there was a cultivator ascending here and rushed over. Moreover, from the looks of it, there should be some friendship between him and this cultivator who was about to ascend. At this moment, the cultivator who was ascending had no intention of answering him. At this moment, as if he had seen an extremely terrifying scene, his expression became extremely ugly and fearful. Immediately afterward, he opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but soon a ray of blood-red light erupted from his body. With a loud bang, his body was completely turned into dust, and he disappeared without a trace in the light of ascension, as if he had never appeared in the first place. The light of ascension trembled slightly at this moment. Then, it distorted, collapsed, and finally disappeared completely. "He's dead." At this moment, no matter how weak one's observation skills were, it was impossible for them to be wrong. Something erased him. In that case, junior brother is also. The senior brothers and junior brothers looked as if they were struck by lightning. Their expressions were lifeless, and endless regret appeared in their eyes. At this moment, they were extremely regretful that they didn't cultivate harder before this. If they had been more diligent and completed the preparations for ascension first, perhaps the ones who ascended first would not have been their junior brother, but them. If that was the case, they would have been the ones to die, and not their junior brother. How regretful! They all cried out in pain. At this moment, one of the cultivators said, "Now is not the time to be regretful. If we don't handle this well, all of us will be erased." This cultivator appeared not far away from the senior brothers and junior brothers, and his expression was filled with an indescribable sense of solemnity. Hearing this, the expressions of the senior brothers and junior brothers changed slightly. Just now, they were wholeheartedly feeling pain for their junior brother, but they didn't think about why their junior brother clearly knew that he shouldn't speak, yet he did everything he could to warn them even if he was to be erased. This was clearly because if he didn't warn them, the lives of their senior brothers and junior brothers would be in danger. This was the only way he could risk the taboo to warn them like this. Who is it? Could it be that powerhouse? He's still toying with our lives, the old man said with a sinister expression. Hearing this, the cultivator who tried to persuade them showed a hint of hesitation in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by confidence. It shouldn't be him. There's no need for him to do this. To him, even if all of us join forces, he can easily deal with us. Why would he use such a brainless scheme against us? And, more importantly, even that powerhouse can't change the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path. It's impossible for him to erase us when we're ascending. This is no longer a method that can be used on this level or even the 5th and 6th levels. The 4th senior brother's voice interrupted at this moment. Hearing this, the expressions of the senior brothers and junior brothers changed. Indeed, from these two perspectives, it was impossible for that expert to be the cultivator who was plotting against all of them in the dark at this moment. However, if it wasn't him, who could it be? Could it be that the cultivators on the 7th, 8th, or even 9th levels were plotting against them? Based on their current understanding of cultivation, they didn't know what kind of power and methods the cultivators on the 7th, 8th, and 9th levels had. However, they had to admit that if it was a cultivator at that level, it was indeed possible for them to do what they encountered now. However, was it possible? As cultivators on the 7th, 8th, and 9th levels, how could they attack cultivators on lower levels like them? Wasn't this a taboo on the Tao Master's path? Many of the cultivators fell into hesitation and silence. What should we do now? A cultivator finally asked. Perhaps we should find a tall person to take care of them. Hearing that question, another cultivator suddenly said, even if the sky collapsed, there would be a tall person to hold it up. This saying seemed to have a market even among the powerhouses of this level. Hearing this, many of the cultivators hesitated and were tempted by the offer. For them, the tallest person on the 4th level was obviously the cultivator who played with them like ants before, Luo Fan. That's right. This matter is not only a disaster for us, it should also be a disaster for him. I don't believe that he will sit back and do nothing about it. Another cultivator said. At this time, the senior and junior brothers didn't participate in the discussion between the many cultivators at all, even the old man who had a ferocious expression and suspected Luo Fan before. At this time, they were not depressed, but they also suffered an extremely huge blow. One must know that the current situation was practically certain that their junior brother had truly died, so there was no longer any meaning for them to ascend and probe the situation. This was obviously a huge blow to them, who had cultivated together for hundreds of millions of years and grown up together. They almost felt that a large part of them was missing. At this time, they still hadn't recovered from the shock. Let me contact the higher-ups first. The 4th senior brother sighed and stopped the chaotic discussion among the many cultivators. Asking for help from Luo Fan was naturally a solution. However, in his opinion, it was the last resort, and there was no other way. After all, not long ago, they were absolutely irreconcilable with Luo Fan. Now, they immediately fell out and asked for help from Luo Fan. In a situation where he had a choice, he definitely wouldn't do such a shameless thing. Moreover, under the current situation, he already had a sufficient reason to contact the higher-ups. Compared to the past when he summoned powerhouses and summoned the mysteries of the 5th level, it was already fundamentally different. In the past, he would be condemned if his various actions were made public, but now that they were made public, he would be praised instead. In this way, it couldn't be any clearer what he should choose. Of course, although he was full of confidence on the surface, there was actually an inexplicable worry in his heart. It's just that I don't know if I can succeed. After all, the hidden disaster had even sealed their ascension passage. Would this method of contacting the higher-ups be sealed as well? If he contacted the higher-ups now, would there be a response? Would he suffer the same fate as those ascenders? All these worries surfaced in his heart at the same time, causing his aura to become slightly unstable. However, no matter how worried he was, he couldn't shirk this responsibility. As the fourth senior brother, he naturally had a great responsibility while holding endless power. Now, the terrifying disaster that spread throughout the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's Road was obviously a responsibility that he couldn't shirk. Hearing the fourth senior brother's words, many of the Tao Master's disciples began to sing praises, one by one saying that the fourth senior brother's method was really too wise. As for the many rogue cultivators, they were also full of praise for his method. In their words, the fourth senior brother had already become a moral model. The fourth senior brother didn't pay much attention to this. At this time, he just began to condense the power of the world cluster in his own body. Gradually, the power of the world cluster, which was at least 100 times stronger than that of almost all the Tao Master's disciples and rogue cultivators in the fourth level, was condensed into a ball of brilliance and appeared in front of him. After completing this step, he grabbed the power and gently waved it, causing the power to constantly wander and change in the void. Not long after, it had already dispersed into countless strands that constantly wandered and glued together in the void. Under the changes of the power, an incomparably huge formation gradually took shape and was gradually activated. It began to emit an increasingly powerful fluctuation that gushed out of the formation and the world cluster. It even stirred the endless creation power around it, causing the creation power around the world cluster to begin to fluctuate. Then, the void of the fourth level of the Tao Master's Road began to tremble slightly. Vaguely, there seemed to be an extremely powerful existence that began to gradually release its power and gradually came into contact with the fluctuation. Did he succeed? This was the thought that came to the minds of many cultivators who sensed the fluctuation at this moment. At this time, the fourth senior brother's expression was extremely ugly. He floated in the center of his own world cluster, his body trembling slightly. The power of the world cluster became increasingly slower as it was pushed forward, and the indescribable fluctuation it caused also became increasingly powerful. Finally, at a certain moment, it seemed to tear something apart, causing a terrifying tearing sound that sounded like a thunderbolt to come from the depths of the void. Amidst this sound, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's Road slightly trembled a few times. This trembling finally caused Luo Fan, who had been immersed in the interaction between his own world cluster and the light of heaven and earth, to break free from that obsession. What's going on? His heart slightly moved, and this question arose from the bottom of his heart. Chapter 2281. This change is not because of me. This thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind as he comprehended what had happened in the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path. Since he entered the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path until now, almost all the changes could be traced back to him. It was either directly or indirectly because of him. It was precisely because of this that when he discovered that the fourth floor had suddenly undergone some indescribable change, he instinctively linked it to himself. He wondered if this change was caused by his direct or indirect influence. However, it was very obvious that after his consideration, he was very sure that none of his actions in the past few days could have caused such a change. What is it? It's not me. Could it be a cultivator of a higher level? But what's the point of this? The cultivators in the fourth level are the foundation of the higher levels. Without the fourth level, there will definitely be problems in the higher levels. However, there shouldn't be a situation where the entire fourth level is completely sealed and the cultivators can't ascend or even be killed at will. Luo Fan thought to himself. His body moved slightly and he had already left his world cluster. Then, he raised his hand and the light of heaven and earth separated from his world cluster and once again gathered above his head. It turned into a fist-sized ball of light that seemed to be alive. The will of heaven and earth in the light of heaven and earth began to produce a subtle vibration in response to Luo Fan's will. It began to detect various factors that Luo Fan could not detect at his level. The level of the will of heaven and earth was much stronger than Luo Fan's will as a living being. Naturally, the various things that it could detect were many times more abundant and detailed. Soon, there was feedback from the light of heaven and earth into his heart. This kind of information was also transmitted in a way that the will of heaven and earth could understand. Therefore, even if the will of heaven and earth had used the simplest and most direct method to transmit everything it had detected, Luo Fan still needed to use his extremely high cultivation to understand, to experience, and to feel. Only then could he extract what the will of heaven and earth wanted to express from the various information that seemed like the changes of heaven and earth. Fortunately, Luo Fan's current cultivation was so high that he could sense when his sixth tribulation would descend. Under such circumstances, he was able to comprehend these things very quickly and reap some rewards. It's the Tao Master's purgatory. After comprehending all of this, he found it hard to believe. According to the will of heaven and earth in the light of heaven and earth, what caused the passage to be cut off, or in other words, what caused the cultivators to be horrified at the last moment of their ascension was a power that he had seen countless times, the power of the Tao Master's prison. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth could sense that the power of the Tao Master prison had completely enveloped the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The connection between this level and the higher or lower levels had been completely cut off by the power of the Tao Master's prison. Could it be that this level has violated some taboo, and now the Tao Master's prison wants to suppress this entire level? How was this possible? How could the Tao Master's path do this? It is only a vassal of the Tao Master's path. Although it has various powers, it is only bestowed by the Tao Master's path. How could it use the power bestowed by the Tao Master's path to suppress the Tao Master's path itself? All sorts of complicated thoughts constantly emerged in Luo Fan's mind. The change in front of him, which was far beyond his imagination, had almost caused him to lose his calm. However, Luo Fan was, after all, Luo Fan. Soon, his powerful will suppressed everything, and his mind regained its calm. Then, he continued to comprehend the results transmitted by the will of heaven and earth in greater detail, searching for deeper and more specific scenes that the will of heaven and earth had previously sensed. This time, it took him several days before he finally obtained a scene that he could understand. A scene that contained endless destructive power and countless experts that even he felt shocked existed in the Tao Master's prison, and they were eyeing the fourth level covetously. No, the appearance and aura of these cultivators are a little strange. When he clearly sensed this scene, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and he felt that things were not as he had previously thought. Any perfect world or great world would have a specific Kane Taoist body based on the appearance of the expert who created it. In this great world of Tao Master, the appearance of the Kane Taoist body was the appearance of Luo Fan at this moment. That was right, almost all the cultivators on the Tao Master's path looked like. After all, the Kane Taoist body was of great benefit to cultivation, and it could even be said to be a necessary body for the pursuit of Tao. Under such circumstances, how could an expert who could cultivate to the Tao Master's path not obtain this Kane Taoist body first? Under such circumstances, how could he not be surprised that there was a cultivator who looked quite different from a born Taoist aptitude cultivator in the power of the Tao Master's purgatory that enveloped the fourth floor? Could it be that these cultivators have made a major mistake in their cultivation? Or, as he thought about it, Luo Fan's eyes became extremely solemn. If they were only cultivators who had made a major mistake in their cultivation, the situation would be better. If there was a mistake in their cultivation, no matter how strong they appeared, there would inevitably be a weakness. With a weakness, it would naturally be extremely easy to deal with it. However, if the other possibility that he was thinking of was true, then it could not be any worse than it already was. With this thought in mind, he began to diligently observe the appearance of the many cultivators in the scene, carefully distinguishing the similarities in their appearances and analyzing the similarities in their auras. As he analyzed, his expression became more and more unsightly, and he became more and more nervous. There was no other reason for this, because there were too many similarities between the many cultivators. There were so many that they seemed to be changing according to a common template. This did not look like someone who had made a major mistake in their cultivation at all. After all, if there was a major mistake in cultivation, causing one's appearance to be different from the appearance of the connate Taoist body, then the change must be random. There must be no pattern in the way that it was twisted. If that was the case, the appearance of the large number of cultivators would be strange, and it would be very difficult to find two similar features, so how could it be as unified as it was now? This appearance made it seem more like they also had the connate Taoist body, but the appearance of the connate Taoist body was not the same as the current appearance of Luo Fan. And this also made it more likely that the speculation that Luo Fan was unwilling to believe was actually true. It really is the Tao Master's prison of another universe, or should I say, the true sage's prison. Luo Fan let out a long sigh, and an inexplicable helplessness appeared on his face. Different connate Taoist bodies naturally indicated that the creator of the universe in which those cultivators grew up was completely different from the creator of the Tao Master universe. This also meant that the power of the Tao Master's prison they were trapped in now seemed to be very similar to the power of the Tao Master's prison in the Tao Master's path, but in essence, the two probably had a completely different origin. Through this, it could naturally be deduced that behind the Tao Master's prison, there was another Tao Master's path that was similar in scale to the Tao Master's path that Luo Fan was in now. The Tao Master's path, or the true sage's path. Such a discovery instantly expanded Luo Fan's understanding of the Tao Master's path from its original state. In addition to this Tao Master's path, there was another Tao Master's path? Then, was there only one more Tao Master's path? Was there a third, fourth, or even innumerable Tao Master's paths? If there was a different Tao Master's prison that could send the power of the Tao Master's prison to attack the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, didn't it mean that there were contradictions, conflicts, and hatred between the different Tao Master's paths? It also meant that if one entered the Tao Master's path, he would probably also encounter external enemies that were difficult to resist. These various understandings caused Luo Fan's expression to change constantly at this time. At this moment, in his heart, the originally incomparably vast Tao Master's path suddenly shrank rapidly. From the heart that originally filled his heart, it turned into an insignificant dot in the boundless chaos. In other words, it was just a thin, winding line. And around this small dot, or rather, this line, there were countless small dots and lines that were densely packed like stars in the sky. There are so many Tao Master's paths, and there are even conflicts between them. For a moment, Luo Fan could not find any adjectives to describe this subversive perception. Fortunately, his worldview was quite tenacious, and his endurance was beyond imagination. Otherwise, the impact of this perception alone would have been enough to shake his foundation and greatly reduce his cultivation. However, it's normal when I think about it. There are endless worlds in the chaos, so how could it be possible that only one true saint in one world would think of opening up a true divine path to cultivate new true saints? Not to mention others. Didn't the true saints in the Tianyuan Great World open up a true divine path to cultivate true saints? In this case, what's so strange about other worlds opening up similar true divine paths? Luo Fan's mind was filled with such thoughts. His mind gradually stabilized, and his expression restored its original calmness. He turned his gaze and continued to look at the images transmitted by the light of heaven and earth. As the knowledge in his heart changed, the scene he saw became clearer. Many of the originally blurry details that didn't even exist were revealed on the scene. This was naturally not because the images had really changed, but because his perception had changed. Many scenes that he had originally ignored due to his lack of understanding began to be noticed by him, causing the images to look like they had changed. In fact, what he saw now was only a small part of it. It was likely that a large part of the light and shadow scenes were still hidden from his view and could not be noticed by him. However, this was no longer something that the current Luo fan could change. This was the limitation of his perception. Unless he could suddenly understand countless things that he did not know, completely subvert his current limited perception, and obtain a perception similar to that of a true divine, it was impossible for him to clearly see all the hidden details in the images. Invading with the power of the Tao Master's prison. In that case, perhaps I can use the power of the Tao Master's prison to resist. A thought suddenly flashed across Luo Fan's mind. Just by sensing the various details surrounding the fourth floor, he already knew that there were not many cultivators in the fourth floor who could resist the cultivators in the fourth floor, apart from him. Even if it was him, he would probably be able to find an expert who seemed to be on par with him to fight against him. In this way, it was obviously unimaginably difficult to use the power of the fourth floor to resist the invasion of the Tao Master's prison from the other path of the Tao Master. After this thought flashed across his mind, his eyes narrowed and he raised his hand. The creation power in front of him began to undergo an unimaginable change. In an instant, an absolute destruction appeared out of thin air. After this destruction appeared, it began to spread wildly in all directions and began to affect more and more creation power, transforming more and more creation power into absolute destruction. It spread in all directions at an extremely crazy speed, and in the blink of an eye, it had already spread to the end of Luo Fan's sight. At this moment, poof, 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 all kinds of terrifying and strange sounds constantly came from the void. This sound was produced by the collapse of the structure of the void. In other words, it was produced by the destruction of the foundation of the fourth floor of the Tao Master's path. With this sound, wisps of the power of the Tao Master's prison appeared out of thin air and began to gradually appear around Luo Fan's body, gradually enveloping his body. Why is it so weak? Seeing this scene, Luo Fan frowned, but he secretly felt helpless. This method of directly destroying the fundamental structure of the Tao Master's path was absolutely forbidden on the Tao Master's path. Normally speaking, at this time, when he used this method to destroy the Tao Master's path, there would inevitably be an overwhelming power of the Tao Master's prison descending to pull him into the Tao Master's prison. However, at this moment, because of this method, the power of the Tao Master's prison that was drawn over by this method was so little. He did not even need to use his own light of heaven and earth, only needed to exert a little strength in his body, and a little struggle was enough to break free from this power, so that it could no longer affect him. Sure enough, it won't work. Luo Fan sighed inwardly, and with a wave of his hand, the power of the Tao Master's prison that gathered around him instantly collapsed, as if it had never appeared. Chapter 2282. As Luo Fan completely repaired the structure of the fourth floor, the power that had been continuously descending from the Tao Master's prison disappeared, and everything around him returned to how it was before Luo Fan took action. It was as if nothing had happened. At this moment, an inexplicable pressure suddenly appeared out of nowhere and directly acted on his heart. As this pressure appeared, the endless creation power card in the fourth floor of the Tao Master's path surged strangely, as if there was an invisible force being projected from the outside world and began to stir the creation power. This is, some kind of creature is invading from the outside world. At this moment, Luo Fan had already instinctively determined what was causing this strange vibration of the creation power. After understanding what it was, he could not help but frown. Could it be that they have already completed all the preparations and are going to launch a full-scale invasion? The them he was referring to was naturally the many experts outside the fourth floor of the Tao Master's path, who were being enveloped by the power of another Tao Master's prison. Before he could finish thinking about it, a crisp sound suddenly spread throughout the fourth floor. Then, an inexplicable revelation appeared in the hearts of all the creatures, including Luo Fan. This revelation pointed to a place on the fourth floor of the Tao Master's path that was originally very ordinary, but had now become extremely special. There, an unimaginably terrifying aura was constantly rising and spreading, enveloping a larger and larger area of the fourth floor, causing more and more creatures to bear this aura. This aura was so powerful that it could not even be described with words. All the creatures who sensed this aura, except for Luo Fan, felt as if they were being stared at by an irresistible natural enemy. Not only were their bodies unable to move, but their minds and thoughts were also unable to think properly. Even Luo Fan could feel an indescribable pressure being generated from this aura, causing everything in the surroundings to come crashing down on him. He had to bear the indescribable pressure, and his body was creaking under this pressure. In the face of this change, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. The light of the world around him trembled slightly, instantly crushing the aura that was attacking him. His body returned to its original relaxed state, and his spirit was freed from the influence of the aura. Immediately after, the light of the world flashed and cut open the Genesis energy, bringing him across the barrier of countless Genesis energy and arriving at the place where he felt strange. It was originally ordinary, but now it had become extremely special. Arriving here, a terrifying scene was reflected directly in his eyes. In that position, the originally ordinary power of creation had been completely suppressed. The endless power of creation that was originally capable of creating millions of clusters of worlds was now completely suppressed into a solid and stable state, supporting and suppressing their existence. A creature that looked like what Luo Fan saw through the perception of the light of the world. It was the kind of creature that was born and grew up in the Tao Master's prison outside, the kind of creature that was not born and grew up in the Tao Master universe. It was a creature that looked completely different from the Kanei Taoism bodies in the Tao Master universe. This creature seemed to be only 10 feet tall, with a long body and a pointed head. It had 2 legs and 2 hands, but each of its legs and hands had 18 fingers and toes. The distribution of its facial features on its head was extremely strange. 4 eyes were arranged in 2 rows on its face, 3 nostrils were in the center of the eyes, and the mouth was just a line below the nostrils. As for its ears, they were slightly opened and closed, just like 2 eyes that were constantly blinking. This kind of appearance should have been extremely ugly, and would have made people feel extremely uncomfortable. However, at this time, this appearance on this creature's body seemed so natural and harmonious. There was even an inexplicable sense of beauty that appeared in Luo Fan's heart. It was as if this creature's appearance was originally like this. This appearance was not ugly, but it was extremely special, or in other words, extremely deep sense of beauty. It really is a Kanei Taoism body from another universe. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan finally completely confirmed his previous guess. Only a similarly Kanei Taoism body could give him such a feeling. What a strange body! I didn't expect such a body to be able to cultivate to this level. At this time, the other party spoke. The voice naturally spoke in a language that Luo Fan had never heard before. However, it was obvious that, for existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others, the difference in language was no longer an obstacle for them to communicate. Any language, as long as it contained a certain thought that the speaker wanted to express, would be able to be received and understood by existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others. Hearing this, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little puzzled. He was still complaining that the other party's body structure was strange and ugly, but the other party was one step ahead of him and said that his body structure was strange. This kind of action, which was like stealing his own lines, made Luo Fan feel a little dumbfounded. This is the Tao Master Universe, where do you come from? However, very soon, Luo Fan put away his dumbfounded expression and said solemnly, This is the Tao Master Universe, where do you come from? As he spoke, the heaven and earth light surged above his head, and in an instant, it completely stirred up the power of creation that had been completely suppressed by him. With the stirring of the power of creation, the creature that suppressed the power of creation began to tremble continuously, and it was difficult for its body to maintain its original stability and autonomy. The aura that was released from its body and affected the entire fourth level, causing almost all the cultivators on the fourth level to be unable to move or think, was instantly broken. So strong! Isn't this only the fourth level? How can there be such a power that can threaten me? The creature's expression changed greatly at this moment, and its 4 eyes blinked, showing a kind of bewilderment. At this time, the aura of the creature leaked out, and Luo Fan finally completely figured out its own strength level. The strength of this creature was stronger than the cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Master Path, whether they were disciples of the Tao Master or individual cultivators. However, it was only equivalent to the cultivators on the fifth level. Compared to Senior Sister Mei, who was summoned by the fourth senior brother, it was only a few times stronger. This kind of strength, for the current Luo Fan, was not much of a threat, even if he could perfectly exert all his strength, power, and means. Moreover, at this moment, this creature was like a fish that had just been thrown into the sky, and it could not even adapt to the environment, let alone exert its strong strength. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how much of a threat this creature posed to Luo Fan. Luo Fan, who had originally planned to communicate with it and get some information through probing, instantly made a decision after understanding the reality of this creature. In an instant, he overturned his original plan. The light of heaven and earth above his head flickered slightly, releasing infinite, incredible, and terrifying power, converging into a wave and pouncing on the strange creature. The creature was just shocked by the strength displayed by Luo Fan, but it did not expect that Luo Fan would be so decisive. For a moment it could not react at all, and could only watch the infinite power summoned by Luo Fan drown it, and finally, like waves after waves, completely crushing all its defensive power and offensive power. In just a few breaths, it had already left behind an incomparably vast huge ruin that even shook the fundamental structure of the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path, and directly suppressed the strange creature in the endless power, or in other words, suppressed by the power of the light of heaven and earth. The various means of the strange creature were worthy of its strength far exceeding that of a cultivator at the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path. During the resistance just now, the various kinds of power it released at every moment were enough to completely destroy any group of world. If it were placed on any cultivator at the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path, it would be enough to completely erase that cultivator, and destroy that cultivator's body and soul. If it were not so, it would not have left behind such a vast battle ruin in such a short period of time. At this moment, at a glance, although it had been suppressed and stirred up, it still maintained a basic stability. At this moment, at a glance, it was unknown how many kinds of strange power, space-time, and power had been derived, mixed together in an incomparably broken and chaotic way. At a glance, it gave people a feeling of extreme dilapidation. And all this chaos, all this dilapidation, could only happen a certain distance away from Luo Fan. Around Luo Fan's body, or in other words, within the range of the light of heaven and earth itself, the creation power was as stable as before, as if nothing had happened. If there was anything different, it would be that at this moment, under the pressure of the light of heaven and earth, a strange four-eyed creature, like a broken sack, quietly floated there. How is this possible, with this kind of strength? How can it appear in the fourth level? Could it be that our target is wrong? From the fourth level to the fifth or sixth level? The creature murmured at this moment, and its 4 eyes flickered with intense disbelief. Looking at the creature's appearance, Luo Fan could not help but frown. This creature did not seem to be an extremely vicious invader like he had previously thought. Whether it was combat strength or temperament, there was actually quite a big difference between it and a real invader. "Let me see your essence." This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. The light of heaven and earth condensed into an invisible spike, and with a sudden rush, it had already pierced into the creature's body, directly penetrating all the barriers of reality, directly into the other party's mind, and into the depths of its memories. Although the light of heaven and earth was condensed by Luo Fan, the true core inside was a kind of heaven and earth will that even he could not understand and control. Such an existence naturally contained boundless profundities and unfathomable power. In this instant, the light of heaven and earth was sent into the creature's mind, and in an instant, it produced endless complex changes that Luo Fan could not understand at all. It swept through the creature's memories at an unimaginable speed. During this process, the creature only reacted to what had happened after the light of heaven and earth had obtained everything it wanted. It was instantly horrified, and it struggled madly. Its body released a kind of hazy splendor, and it attacked the light of heaven and earth with all its might, trying to expel the light of heaven and earth. This kind of hazy splendor was extremely mysterious and heavy. Even compared to the light of heaven and earth, it seemed to have a great advantage on a certain level. If it had used this kind of hazy splendor from the beginning, perhaps Luo Fan would have been in some trouble. The light of heaven and earth would have needed to change thousands of times more to be able to suppress it like before. However, at this moment, when Luo Fan's light of the world had already pierced into his heart and received all the secrets in his heart, the situation was no longer the same. In this instant, the light of heaven and earth naturally changed in a way that even Luo Fan could not understand. It easily pierced into the hazy splendor, and like countless silk webs, it wrapped around every detail of the hazy splendor, completely wrapping it up from the inside out. Under this wrapping, although the hazy splendor was illusory, it was like amber or crystal. It stopped inside and outside the creature's body, turning the creature into a huge crystal, or a huge piece of amber. It made him feel as if he had turned into a small flying insect frozen in amber. This change caused the strange creature's expression to become extremely terrified and aghast. An indescribable despair suddenly appeared in its 4 eyes. This expression made Luo Fan, who saw its gaze, feel a little strange. This doesn't seem to be the despair caused by the threat to its own life. Instead, it seems like it has made a huge mistake, causing something that it cares about, something that is extremely grand, and even greater than its own life to be threatened, to be about to be destroyed. Why is this so? As he pondered, endless information began to pour into his heart from the light of heaven and earth. This information was arranged from the perspective of the will of heaven and earth. It was profound, complicated, mysterious, and strange. Even though the will of heaven and earth had arranged this information in the way that Luo Fan could most easily understand, Luo Fan still found it difficult to understand this information, and it was difficult to distinguish the fundamental mysteries contained in this information. Chapter 2283. Through the analysis of the countless pieces of information that had been plundered from the inside of this creature, Luo Fan slowly understood why he was in despair. He also understood the significance of what he had unintentionally done just now. I didn't expect there to be such a restriction. It seems like I really stumbled upon it by accident. At this moment, such a thought appeared in his mind. At this moment, the boundless power of the Tao Master's prison emerged out of nowhere. Like a shark that smelled blood, it frantically gathered towards the creature that was imprisoned by the light of heaven and earth in front of Luo Fan. At this moment, the misty light emitted by the creature began to tremble violently, as if there was an infinite and terrifying pressure acting directly on the light. The despair in the eyes of the 4-eyed creature that came from the other side of the great world became increasingly intense. However, although he was in despair, he did not give up resisting. Instead, he activated the misty light in his body without any hesitation. Under this kind of light, his body seemed to suddenly expand by many times, and the pressure around him increased by many times. Under this pressure, the surrounding light of heaven and earth released by Luo Fan also suffered a huge impact, causing Luo Fan to feel a little strained. The endless power of creation also violently rioted due to this change, and bits of destruction appeared in the power of creation. This destruction was even more powerful and absolute than the destruction caused by the power of the Tao Master's prison that Luo Fan had tested previously. Compared to this destruction, the destruction caused by Luo Fan was as gentle as a comfort. Puft, 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 puft. At this moment, strange sounds were constantly heard from the surrounding areas of destruction. Under these sounds, the structure of the fourth level of the Tao Master's prison was faintly collapsing. All kinds of power that were extremely similar to the power of the Tao Master's prison that was constantly gathering in the surroundings, but were inexplicably different in nature, were constantly being emitted from these holes. At this moment, an indescribable anger came from nowhere and enveloped the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's prison. It directly drove away all the creatures that were previously in the fourth level. The shock and panic in the hearts of all the cultivators and creatures that remained in the fourth level made them angry as well. The anger of the Tao Master's prison, or in other words, the anger of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, Luo Fan had already guessed the nature of this anger. At this moment, the endless power of the Tao Master's prison bubbled out of nowhere and continuously gathered towards the four-eyed creature in front of Luo Fan. It constantly piled up and surged like waves, completely drowning this area. The power of the Tao Master's prison was something that all cultivators should avoid. Once any creature sensed the existence of this power, they would feel a sense of vigilance and panic from the bottom of their hearts. However, at this moment, any cultivator that sensed the gathering power of the Tao Master's prison, including Luo Fan, could clearly feel an indescribable sense of security from the bottom of their hearts. It was as if the power of the Tao Master's prison had changed from an existence that exerted pressure on them to a source of support, a source of security for them. This strange change made many cultivators unable to react for a moment. However, at this moment, some of the more daring cultivators had already begun to quickly make their way towards where Luo Fan was. In other words, the center where the power of the Tao Master's prison was gathering was rushing over. For the experts of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, distance was no longer an obstacle to them. As long as they made up their minds and took action, they could almost instantly cross the barrier of the endless creation energy and directly arrive at any location in the fourth level. Therefore, in just a few breaths, there were already hundreds of thousands of cultivators gathered around this location. Among them, the majority were disciples of the Tao Master's path. What is this? When the cultivators saw the strange creature that was suspended in front of Luo Fan and shrouded in a misty splendor that was constantly destroying the surrounding creation energy and the fundamental structure of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, they were all extremely shocked and could not understand what was happening in front of them. These creatures did not have a deep understanding of the differences between different worlds and the similarities and differences between different born Taoism aptitudes like Luo Fan. However, they were not born in such a small place like perfect heaven and earth, so they naturally had a good understanding of this kind of thing. As a result, when almost all the cultivators saw this creature, countless thoughts began to form in their minds. They faintly knew that a huge problem had appeared. How could this be? Why would such an enemy appear? The cultivators were filled with inexplicable panic. At this moment, figures emerged from the hole in the fourth level that had been blasted open by the misty splendor. These figures had different appearances, but their physical characteristics were exactly the same as the creature that had been imprisoned by Luo Fan. Obviously, they were from the same race as that creature. You're really useless. You can't even do something like testing. A disdainful snort came from the mouth of one of the creatures. It was as cold as ice, making all the cultivators who heard it feel a chill from the bottom of their hearts. Of course, the language that the voice used was exactly the same as the language that the strange creature had used earlier. It was a language that was completely unfamiliar to the cultivators. However, like Luofan, for all the cultivators who could step into the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, the difference in language was no longer an obstacle to their communication. Even if it was a language that they had never heard before, as long as it contained the will they wanted to express, then they would naturally receive all the meaning that the language wanted to express, and there would be no obstacles at all. How dare you violate the war agreement? At this moment, the fourth senior brother said something that all the cultivators did not expect. At this moment, Luofan could not help but turn his curious eyes to the fourth senior brother. It seems that he knows something that I don't. There's actually someone who knows about the war agreement? The extremely cold voice revealed an inexplicable curiosity at this time. The war agreement stipulates that the war must not affect the 6th level and below. This is only the 4th level, yet you dare to invade so wantonly. Aren't you afraid of being besieged by all the camps? The fourth senior brother said with an extremely serious expression. There was an indescribable majesty in his voice. Hearing this, the voice laughed and said, "Since you know about the war agreement, then it's easy to talk. You should know that the war agreement was signed between us and the disciples of your Tao Master. This kind of agreement naturally has a premise, that is, it only includes the levels controlled by your Tao Master's disciples. The current ruler of this level is not your Tao Master's disciple. The war agreement doesn't apply to you." Hearing this, all the cultivators, whether they knew about the war agreement or not, could not help but change their expressions. Fourth senior brother, in particular, had an extremely ugly expression on his face. Even when he was easily defeated by Luofan, his expression was not as ugly as it was now. He did not know whether there was such a premise in the war agreement. However, he understood that now that the other party had launched an attack with this reason, it was at least enough to reduce the probability of being besieged by more than half. After all, this kind of ambiguous reason could be right or wrong. In this way, if there were enough camps, many camps would definitely agree with this reason. Once they agreed, they would not be able to participate in the siege, and the so-called agreement to attack together would naturally be mostly useless. If one thought about it more darkly, there might even be a large number of camps supporting them, which would greatly increase the strength of the camp in front of them. This would make the price and danger of attacking together too great, so that they would not even be attacked. At this time, he wanted to say that he was the disciple of the Tao Master and was also the ruler of the 4th level. However, he knew that it was impossible to hide this from the experts opposite him. After all, as long as one's strength reached a certain level, it would be absolutely easy to determine who was the ruler. He did not believe that the other party would not have an expert who could do this in such a large-scale attack. Therefore, it could be imagined that even if he lied like this, he would only be humiliating himself. "Save me!" At this moment, the creature in front of Luofan, who was engulfed by the power of the Tao Master's prison, spat out these 3 words with great difficulty. At this moment, the boundless radiance emitted from his body had already been compressed to the point that it returned to his body, and his body was rapidly turning into charcoal under the corrosion of the endless power of the Tao Master's prison. In the short time that he spoke, the shock caused by his words had already caused more than half of his body to completely collapse and turn into powder. This kind of situation seemed to be extremely tragic and terrible. You're just a piece of trash who can't even do a small thing. What right do you have to waste our power? At this moment, an extremely cold voice sounded from within the hole. Then, a figure slowly walked out from the crowd of creatures. It was obviously the person who had spoken just now. It was a creature that was 2 heads taller than ordinary creatures. Its body was incomparably strong, and it was surrounded by endless killing intent. Amidst the killing intent, one could vaguely see that the endless spacetime was constantly being destroyed. Just by appearing, this creature's presence had already surpassed the sum of all the other living beings. As soon as Luo Fan saw this existence, he felt an indescribable sense of danger shrouding him. Even his light of heaven and earth seemed to have undergone various indescribable subtle changes at this moment. It was completely focused on that creature, and firmly protected Luo Fan from all aspects. So powerful! At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. This creature was probably even more powerful than the waxen middle-aged man from the 6th level that he had met previously. If it attacked him regardless of everything, the chances of him being able to withstand it were really not high. After understanding this, his expression turned ugly. It had been a long time since he had encountered such a situation where his life and death was no longer under his control. All this while, he had almost always used an absolutely invincible method to deal with all the opponents, enemies, and even all the other cultivators that he had encountered. Even when he faced the middle-aged man from the 6th level, he still had the confidence to protect himself, even though he couldn't compare to the middle-aged man from the 6th level in terms of absolute strength. Only at this moment, when he saw this strange cultivator in front of him, did he feel a sense of danger from the bottom of his heart. He was not confident that he could escape from the other party's attack. What's the point, Jail Wrecker King? Isn't it only a matter of time before he's discovered? Why blame him? At this moment, another voice was heard from the crowd. Compared to the so-called Jail Wrecker King's voice, this voice was slightly calmer. However, it was still cold, sending chills down one's spine. Discovering is one thing, making a mistake is another. The Jail Wrecker King completely ignored the voice and only said that. At this moment, a figure that looked like a woman walked out of the crowd. This figure was much shorter than the Jail Wrecker King, and the lines on her body were much softer. However, her strength was not inferior to the Jail Wrecker King's at all. She also gave Luo Fan a strong sense of threat. Just as they were conversing, the creature that was first suppressed by Luo Fan had already let out an incomparably mournful shriek. It was directly turned into charcoal by the power of the Tao Master's prison. After another tremor, it completely turned into powder and disappeared without a trace. Neither the Jail Wrecker King nor the female creature that walked out of the crowd showed any unusual reaction to his death. Obviously, they did not care about what happened to the creature. It seems like it's about time. At this moment, the female creature said. Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly felt that the power of the Tao Master's prison, which was constantly emerging out of thin air and rushing towards the holes created by the creatures that had just been destroyed, suddenly stagnated. It was as if it had finally encountered an obstacle that could not be broken, or even affected. Luo Fan secretly cursed in his heart. Without hesitation, he suddenly sent the light of heaven and earth into the hole. An endless impact erupted, completely targeting the position of the environment and causing millions of changes, trying its best to close the hole. Chapter 2284. Although Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth was incomparably fast and could perfectly respond to all the situations he encountered at every moment, easily defeating any of the hazy lights and delaying the speed at which those hazy lights could reach their targets, Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth was incomparably fast. However, there were just too many rays of light. Even if not all the living beings in the other Tao Master's prison could emit the misty brilliance, just the small portion of living beings that could emit the misty brilliance was already enough to be counted in the hundreds of millions. Under such circumstances, countless rays of light came crashing down. Even if Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth was amazing and could easily deal with all the power, it was still no match for the terrifying number of rays of light. In the end, he could only watch as the light continued to expand the hole in the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. Oh no. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan understood that the prison troublemaker king was clearly stalling for time in order to integrate the power of many living beings to achieve his current goal. Obviously, the tiny hole from before was not enough for them. Only when it expanded to a certain extent and reached a scale where they could easily enter and exit, could they bear the burden of invading the entrance to the fourth level. Very quickly, that hole had already expanded to a size that was countless times larger than before. At this time, nearly 1% of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path had been filled by the hole. Looking through the hole, the boundless power of the Tao Master's prison was like a huge sky curtain that was about to collapse, covering the entire area behind the hole. And in that area, there were countless four-eyed living beings. The number of these living beings was at least 100 times more than what Luo Fan had seen in the image transmitted by the light of heaven and earth. This was naturally not what the light of heaven and earth had sensed. There was a huge gap between the reality and what Luo Fan had sensed. It was because there was a huge gap between the information transmitted by the will of heaven and earth and the reality that Luo Fan had sensed. If he could really fully understand all the information transmitted by the will of heaven and earth, then what he could see would definitely be more than what he could see with his naked eyes, and he would definitely be able to obtain more truth from the opposite side. Luo Fan was not surprised by this change. At this time, his expression was extremely solemn. Since they dared to invade a certain level of the Tao Master's path, they must have made all preparations. Such a number was only passable at most, but it wasn't something to be surprised about. However, although the number of the opposite side was only passable compared to the number of invading Tao Master's path, for him, such a number had reached an almost unstoppable level. This naturally made him extremely solemn. Come on, the real challenge. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan took a deep breath and exhaled softly. With this exclamation, his face slightly shook. The light of heaven and earth, which had been constantly entangled with and blocking the many misty lights in the hole, suddenly shrank and easily escaped from the entanglement of the many misty lights. It suddenly converged and returned to the top of his head, shrinking into a ball the size of a fist. The way it came and went as it pleased was enough to show that the light of heaven and earth had an absolute advantage over the misty light. It could be said that if it had not been for the large number of the opposite lights, it would have been absolutely impossible for them to achieve their goal and expand the whole to such an extent. At this time, the troublemaker king looked at Luo Fan with a sneer on his face. It seems that you are really scheming. You actually suppressed yourself to stay in this fourth level. Fortunately, we took action first. Otherwise, I'm afraid we would be in danger. As he spoke, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward. In the blink of an eye, he had finally stepped into the fourth level of the Tao Master's path for the first time. The moment he stepped through the hole, an inexplicable satisfaction emerged on his face. Finally, I've escaped from that damned power, he murmured as his aura began to rise crazily. This terrifying aura continued to oppress the surroundings. Even the power of the Tao Master's prison in the surrounding Tao Master's path began to retreat under this terrifying aura, gradually creating a vacuum of power. In the face of this aura, the surrounding cultivators who had been able to withstand it all revealed a look of fear. Even the fourth senior brother could not help but tremble slightly as he retreated uncontrollably. As he moved, the many four-eyed creatures behind him began to step through the hole one by one and appeared on the fourth level. They were truly facing everything on the fourth level, including Luo Fan. Naturally, Luo Fan could guess the deeper meaning behind the troublemaker king's words. The damned power mentioned by the jailbreaker king was probably the power of the Tao Master's prison that had enveloped him previously. It was the power of the Tao Master's path. At this time, he was so concerned about being able to escape from that power. It seemed that he could only truly escape the control of the Tao Master's prison by stepping into the other Tao Master's path. Based on this, it was likely that the many four-eyed creatures behind him felt the same way. This probably meant that the reason why they had invaded the Tao Master's prison was not because they wanted to, but because they were forced by the Tao Master's prison or the Tao Master's path. Of course, even though he understood this, Luo Fan did not feel much at ease. After all, regardless of whether they wanted to invade the Tao Master's path of their own volition or not, their actions were already an invasion. Perhaps it's not of your own volition, but an invasion is an invasion. As he spoke, Luo Fan's eyes flashed and an extremely sharp and strange power shot out from his light of heaven and earth. It instantly cut through the creation power, the power of the Tao Master's prison, and even the void of the fourth level. In a flash, it had already arrived in front of the troublemaker king and slammed towards his head. This power was so strange and mysterious. Although it was only equivalent to the power of his own world cluster, it completely targeted the weakness of the power of the Tao Master's purgatory, as well as the weakness of the misty splendor that the light of heaven and earth came into contact with. This was why it could easily cut through all defenses and arrive in front of the Hellbreaker King. The troublemaker king's eyes flashed and an unparalleled power suddenly rushed out from his body and directly collided with the power that was rushing towards his head. Crack! A terrifying explosion that sounded like the destruction of the heavens and earth erupted from the point of contact. Earth-shattering fluctuations frantically spread out in all directions. In the blink of an eye, billions of worlds and spacetime were born, before they were completely destroyed, leaving behind endless fragments and ruins that were constantly being pushed out in all directions. In the blink of an eye, the boundless power of the Tao Master's prison, the boundless power of creation, and even the void of the fourth level were filled with the ruins. Moreover, the ruins seemed to be growing and extending at all times. The ruins were getting thicker and stronger at all times. The scene was so strange and terrifying that it was hard to accept it. The power that the light of heaven and earth emitted had only reached the level of the power of the world cluster. Even if the light of heaven and earth had come into contact with the various powers and could penetrate through all the weaknesses in an absolutely targeted manner, cutting apart all power, and brilliance, it still couldn't change the nature of the power. In the face of a power that hadn't been analyzed at all, it could only display its intrinsic effects. Therefore, the power emitted by the light of heaven and earth had already collapsed. Although it had blown the Hellwrecker King's hair, he wasn't injured at all. In the face of this change, Luo Fan was not surprised. He didn't stop moving at all. He continued to urge the light of heaven and earth to continuously send out energy that had undergone various changes and adjustments towards the Hellwrecker King. The amount of the energy kept increasing, and its nature was changing at an unimaginable speed. At every moment, it was adjusting itself according to the feedback of the energy coming into contact with the opponent's energy. In just a few breaths, the energy had already analyzed the Hellwrecker King's methods and was about to land on the Hellwrecker King. Even though the Hellwrecker King's level was much higher than the fourth level and he was even stronger than Luo Fan. However, he definitely wouldn't be able to get away with it if the countless energy that was targeting him landed on him. Being sealed was almost the best outcome for him. At this moment, a huge figure suddenly emerged from the Hellwrecker King's body. This figure was a bronze statue. It looked very similar to the Hellwrecker King, but it exuded an eternal and unshakable aura. After the appearance of the bronze statue, the Hellwrecker King's aura suddenly changed. He had originally been in a very sorry state, but now his aura was crazily rising. He suddenly suppressed all the strange phenomena around him and his sorry state. Even the countless energy emitted by the light of heaven and earth that was about to land on him completely froze at this moment. A magic weapon! At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly understood. This bronze statue was a magic weapon. A pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure that was close to a primordial spiritual treasure. Judging from the aura it exuded, it was probably closer to a primordial spiritual treasure than any pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure that Luo Fan had ever seen before. With the appearance of this bronze statue, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path began to tremble even more violently. The power of the Tao Master's prison, which had been repelled and replaced by ruins, began to skyrocket. In just a few breaths of time, the power of the Tao Master's prison had increased by more than 100 times, even before the bronze statue had completely eliminated the power emitted by Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. Vaguely, many figures that had never appeared before began to appear out of thin air amidst those powers. Although these figures were blurry, the strength of each of them was self-evident. Although it was still in a blurry state, there was already an incomparably terrifying aura that was constantly being emitted. It was constantly fighting against the endless terrifying aura released by the invaders, causing the oppressive aura that had enveloped the entire fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path to dissipate. Not good. Your power has exceeded the limit. If this continues, the defense mechanism of the Tao Master's path will be activated. Quickly restrain your attacks. At this moment, the four-eyed female creature from before cried out in alarm. As she spoke, she quickly moved her hands and countless strange runes emerged out of thin air. In the blink of an eye, they had already constructed an extremely vast, complex, and mysterious formation in the void. It directly enveloped the Hellbreaker King and the bronze statue on his body. At this moment, the Hellbreaker King's eyes that were filled with rage suddenly cleared up. The bronze statue that had just completely emerged began to rapidly shrink back into his body in an instant. With this change, the power of the surrounding Tao Master's prison also stopped changing. The indistinct, blurry figure that was gradually turning into reality also stopped transforming into reality. They just maintained this blurry appearance. With Luo Fan's eyesight at this time, he could even see that among the blurry figures, many of them had incomparable anger on their faces. They were struggling with all their might, wanting to break away from the illusory state and truly descend with their true appearance. Unfortunately, this kind of rule that Luo Fan had yet to figure out was too strong. Even if their momentum alone was enough to fight against the many powerful invaders, as long as they did not meet the conditions to descend, they would not be able to descend. Seeing this, the Hellbreaker King's eyes showed a slight hint of relief. "Hurry up, we must change the nature of this level as soon as possible," he ordered. Following his order, the many four-eyed creatures that had rushed into this level behind him responded one by one. Their eyes revealed an extremely fanatical look, and they began to release either a misty light or a variety of mysterious powers. They constantly blasted in all directions and tried their best to infiltrate the void of the fourth level. In a way that Luo Fan could not understand, they were eroding the fourth level. In the face of this change, Luo Fan's expression became extremely grave. At this time, this was the biggest weakness of his side. Chapter 2285. The Prison Breaker King's strength was actually stronger than Luo Fan's. Even the Prison Breaker King was not helpless against Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth, which possessed the true will of heaven and earth. The reason why he looked so flustered just now, as if he was no match for the light of heaven and earth, and could not do anything under the attack of the light of heaven and earth, was that he had scruples. In other words, it was the restrictions imposed on him by the Tao Master path. However, as long as he had enough strength as his trump card, no matter how bad the situation was, he would always have a trump card that could turn the tables. This made it so that the strength he could exert in this level was far less than that of Luo Fan, but he was still confident that he could entangle Luo Fan, so that he could not spare any effort to resist the actions of the numerous four-eyed creatures at this moment. Obviously, that was what the Prison Breaker King was doing. Without waiting for Luo Fan to take action, he had already taken the initiative to release countless misty splendors, which rushed straight at Luo Fan. At first glance, these misty splendors seemed to be no different from the misty splendors released by other creatures, but as long as Luo Fan carefully sensed them, he would find that these misty splendors contained all kinds of extremely subtle and mysterious existences. These existences made these misty splendors contain power that was many times stronger than other misty splendors. Even when faced with these splendors, Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth could not deal with them easily. It needed to constantly invest a huge amount of resources into these splendors to analyze and deduce them, so that it could find a corresponding way to deal with these misty splendors and destroy these misty splendors. However, as soon as the light of heaven and earth analyzed the various secrets of this wave of splendors, the next wave of splendors underwent various indescribable changes, causing the previous analysis and deduction to completely turn into bubbles. This caused the light of heaven and earth to have to repeat the previous process in order to deal with the new wave of splendors once again. In this way, the light of heaven and earth fell into a vicious cycle that would never end, and there wasn't the slightest bit of energy that could be extracted and used by Luo Fan. As expected, I've been caught. At this moment, Luo Fan let out a sigh. From this method, one could tell that the Hellbreaker King definitely had a lot of experience dealing with the light of the world. If he didn't have any experience, he definitely wouldn't have been able to find a way to detain the light of the world so quickly. However, it was clear that even though the Jailbreaker King had been detained by Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth, he still felt pressured. At this moment, he did not show the slightest bit of complacency. Instead, his expression was indescribably nervous. His 4 eyes were emitting a boundless calculating light. This kind of light could only be produced by an existence that was carrying out billions of complicated calculations in his mind at all times. It was precisely because of this immense pressure that the Hell Troublemaker King was unable to divert his attention to carry out the fundamental mission of the other side. From a certain perspective, the two of them could be considered to have perished together. However, this sort of mutual destruction was obviously more beneficial to the Hellbreaker King's side. On Luo Fan's side, he was the only one who truly possessed combat strength. On the other hand, there were countless people on the Hellbreaker King's side who possessed combat strength. I can't wait. At this moment, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, he began to mobilize his corresponding existences on the other levels and began to pounce on the numerous creatures on the Hellbreaker King's side. Originally, he was unwilling to make this ability, which allowed him to manipulate his corresponding existences on the various levels, public. After all, even the disciples of the Tao Master on the 6th level didn't have such an ability. If he made it public, it would definitely attract too much attention, which would cause him a lot of trouble. However, it was clear that at this moment, even if he was unwilling, he had no choice but to use this method. After all, no matter how one looked at it, the Hellbreaker King's side was not a benevolent existence. If they really occupied the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path for themselves and completely changed its nature, then Luo Fan, their opponent in front of them, would most likely be eliminated by them at the first possible moment. Now that there was no way to leave the 4th level, the only thing Luo Fan could do now was obviously to use all his means to stop the other side. The number of existences on the various levels that Luo Fan could communicate with and control had already reached an incredible level. At this moment, he mobilized the existences on the various levels with all his might. The total number of existences was probably more than 100 times more than the number of invaders at this moment. If there was an existence that could see through the various levels, at this moment, they would be able to see how great of an attack Luo Fan had launched. This kind of attack was simply like the waves of heaven and earth, endless and endless. Its power and terrifying momentum were enough to completely destroy everything in front of it. However, such a wave, in the process of crashing, was met with a kind of resistance that was getting stronger and stronger. In the end, before really coming into contact with the corresponding existences on the various levels of the invaders, it was already powerless to move forward. It could only stay alone in the areas that were either long or short from those existences, unable to move anymore. This is the power of the Tao Master's prison opposite us. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled. In an instant, he determined what exactly was blocking in front of the existences on the various levels of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, the level of its power was obviously enough to suppress the cultivators on the various levels of the Tao Master's path. The level of its power was obviously enough to suppress the cultivators on the various levels of the Tao Master's path. In other words, whether it was the first, second, eighth or ninth level of the Tao Master's prison, once a cultivator made a mistake, the power of the Tao Master's prison would definitely be enough to completely suppress them. Under such circumstances, the power of the Tao Master's prison naturally had the ability to suppress and resist the methods, power and the ability of the cultivators on the various levels of the Tao Master's path. What Luo Fan mastered was the ability to communicate and control the corresponding existence of each level. No matter how confident he was, he did not think that this ability was beyond the scope of all levels of the Tao Master's path. In this way, his ability was within the scope of the power of the Tao Master's prison, which was really normal. In fact, if this ability could break through the power of the Tao Master's prison, Luo Fan would be surprised and feel that some existence was setting up some kind of conspiracy against him. Based on the analysis of the power of the Tao Master's prison, at this moment, it was not surprising that the attack that Luo Fan launched to communicate with the corresponding existences on the various levels of the Tao Master's prison was blocked. However, a block was a block after all. Even if he had already guessed it, when the power was really blocked, Luo Fan still felt a little helpless. With a thought, the corresponding existences on the various levels of the Tao Master's prison retreated slightly and waited at the boundary where the power of the Tao Master's prison could and could not affect. The range of the power of the Tao Master's prison was definitely limited. The reason why he could not do anything to those living beings was because they were still within the range of the power of the Tao Master's prison. And obviously, those living beings could not stay within the range of the power of the Tao Master's prison forever. After all, what they wanted to do was to invade, and not to defend. And as long as they left the range of the power, it would be Luo Fan's opportunity. With this thought in mind, although the situation seemed to be worsening, Luo Fan still did not show any signs of being discouraged. Instead, he remained calm and quietly waited for the time to come. While he waited, the numerous four-eyed living beings had already corroded and assimilated the incomparably large area around the hole, transforming it into a state that looked the same as before, but had undergone a change that Luo Fan could not understand or describe. In this state, those living beings seemed to have been further liberated. They released more and more of their strength and power, and their auras also became smoother and smoother. Their expressions also became more and more relaxed. There were even some living beings that had already surpassed Luo Fan's position and headed towards a wider area behind Luo Fan. Fortunately, there was still a considerable distance between this place and Luo Fan's own world cluster. If these assimilated areas wanted to affect Luo Fan's world cluster, there was still a long way to go. Otherwise, Luo Fan's world cluster would have already undergone indescribable changes. As for the power of the Tao Master's prison of the Tao Master's path, it had now been pushed out of this assimilated area. Although the countless figures in the power of the Tao Master's prison grew increasingly furious and violent, they ultimately could not break free from the restriction and could not materialize into reality. They could only helplessly watch as the power of the Tao Master's prison was constantly pushed back, constantly making way for the invaders to assimilate. Time passed bit by bit, and very quickly, half a year had passed. In the past half a year, the cultivators of the fourth layer had also come to their senses and organized hundreds of attacks to fight against these invaders. Among them, they displayed many inspiring heroic deeds, which stimulated their potential to the limit. The scene was so heroic that even Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh in admiration when he saw it. However, it was a pity that there was a gap between them. Even if they had the will and courage, they could only watch themselves fail again and again when they were not strong enough. In the end, in the short span of half a year, the cultivators left behind millions of corpses and hundreds of thousands of world clusters in the assimilated area. Perhaps it was the existence of the ruins of the world clusters that inspired the cultivators' courage. After all, the appearance of the ruins showed that if they did not resist and allowed the assimilation of the invaders to affect their world clusters, only death would await them. On a certain day after half a year, the eyes of Luo Fan, who could be said to be in the center of the assimilated area, suddenly lit up and a thought flashed through his mind. There's a chance. With this thought, his corresponding existences on each level took action at the same time. Earth-shattering waves rushed forward from all directions, surging towards the many invaders. At this moment, in the real world, a large number of invaders were in an area that had exceeded a certain boundary. Although they were still in an area that had been assimilated, the power of the other party's Tao sovereign's prison had thinned to a certain extent and was no longer able to provide much support to them. This was the case in the real level, and it was also the case in many other levels. When Luo Fan's corresponding existence rushed towards their corresponding existences, although he felt some resistance, big or small, in the end, this resistance only delayed the advancement of his corresponding existence. In the end, his corresponding existence still broke through the layers of resistance and forcibly collided with the corresponding existences of the invaders on various levels. For a time, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path fell silent. It was as if an invisible hand had suddenly pressed the switch to the passage of time. Immediately afterward, the countless four-eyed creatures that were charging at the front silently crumbled. They didn't even have the chance to scream before they were completely reduced to dust. Then, they turned into nothingness, as if they had never existed in the first place. This change made everyone on both sides, except for Luo Fan, dumbfounded. They could not believe what they had seen. What is this? Which expert did this? For the practitioners on Luo Fan's side, this was a pleasant surprise. However, for the invaders on the other side, their feelings were completely different. At this moment they felt a chill from the bottom of their hearts, filling their bodies and minds. Who is it? What kind of attack is this? How could so many of them be erased without a sound? This was the panic in their hearts. For a time, the invaders could not help but retreat, and the assimilation process that had been advancing came to a halt. How could they not be worried that such an attack would fall on them and erase them silently like their previous companions? As for why they retreated, there was no need to explain. Although they did not know what the silent attack was, they naturally knew that the further forward they went, the more dangerous it would be, and the further back they went, the safer they would be. At this time, the Hellbreaker King looked at Luo Fan with an extremely ugly expression and said, "It's you." Chapter 2286. At this time, Luo Fan had no intention of answering him. At this moment, he was only paying attention to the changes in the power of the Tao Master's prison around him. This was because he suddenly discovered that as he wiped out the four-eyed creatures, the power of the Tao Master's prison, which was originally unable to continue growing, seemed to have switched on another switch and began a new round of growth. The figures in the power of the Tao Master's prison, which were originally struggling to descend but could not do so, began to solidify again. Could it be that wiping out these creatures from other great worlds will trigger the Tao Master's prison? Such a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind at this moment. With such a thought, his expression became a little subtle. The ability to see through the phenomenon to see the essence was almost instinctive to Luo Fan. If wiping out the invaders could trigger a reaction from the Tao Master's prison, there must be a deeper change behind it. And the change in Luo Fan's gaze was obviously not just limited to the surface. At that moment, countless thoughts flashed through his mind. All sorts of possibilities kept surging in his heart. It's the aura. After vetoing various possibilities, Luo Fan finally came to a conclusion. The power of the Tao Master's prison was obviously triggered by the moment when the invaders died, a subtle aura that was different from the Tao Master world. Once any living creature died, it would release a subtle aura that ordinary living creatures, or even ordinary cultivators, could not sense. This aura was the aura of life that originally existed in the body of any living creature. And this aura of life naturally contained the fundamental essence of the living creature. In any great world, or even any spacetime, the essence that the living creatures possessed was obviously different. And this subtle difference would naturally cause their life aura to be more or less different. Under such circumstances, the life aura that different living creatures lost at the moment of their death naturally contained the essence of the great world. At this moment, this essence was clearly enough to trigger a reaction from the power of the Tao Master's prison and produce a change within the rules of the Tao Master's prison. That was why the death of those living beings would cause the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison to descend on an even larger scale. Since he understood this, Luo Fan no longer had any doubts about what to do. In that instant, the light of heaven and earth above his head underwent a subtle change. Waves of boundless aura began to rise in a frenzy, constantly crushing down on all the four-eyed beings in the surroundings. This kind of aura was extremely mysterious. It wasn't just an ordinary aura that contained the essence of heaven and earth. Instead, it was an existence that seemed to be some kind of divine ability or magic art. Once it found the source of any aura, it would start to attack the source of the aura from an indescribable angle, forcing the source of the aura to produce various changes on its own to resist the attack. Be it the Hell-Breaker King or the other four-eyed creatures, the moment they were enveloped by the aura, the subtle aura that came with life began to swell involuntarily. In the blink of an eye, their auras had already swelled to more than 10 times their original strength. A breeze that could not be seen or even sensed by the naked eye began to blow in all directions from the area that had been assimilated by the invaders. Following this change, the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison that had been expelled from the assimilated area suddenly began to stir violently like a shark that had smelled blood. In the midst of this turmoil, the human figures that existed within it began to solidify at a speed visible to the naked eye. Oh no! The Hell-Breaker King's expression changed drastically. In that instant, the misty brilliance emitted from his body suddenly changed. The various mysteries that were originally hidden in the depths of the brilliance that only enhanced the quality of the brilliance but did not reveal themselves suddenly surged, causing the brilliance to suddenly become illusory. The pressure on Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth had only taken an instant to increase by more than 10,000 times. The light of heaven and earth could not react to this sudden increase in power for a moment and was suddenly forced to retreat. It was almost compressed into its original small ball and returned to the top of his head. The aura that was originally released, which could cause the auras of the many four-eyed creatures to surge, was also restrained and no longer appeared. However, it was a pity that it was still a step too late. At this moment, the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison had already completely solidified hundreds of thousands of figures, finally out. A voice sounded from the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison. The voice was filled with relief, anger, and an indescribable ecstasy. The figures that had emerged from the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison all had similar physical characteristics to Luo Fan. In other words, they all looked like the innate Tao bodies of the great Tao Sovereign world. The person who had spoken was someone that Luo Fan had seen before. It was the waxen middle-aged man who had come from the 5th level and above, the one who had been summoned by Senior Sister Mei. Back then, the yellow-faced middle-aged Tao Sovereign's disciple had been suppressed by the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison and disappeared from the 4th level. He never imagined that he would be able to escape the Tao Sovereign's prison after such a short period of time. This caused his heart to tremble, and he found it hard to control himself. The waxen middle-aged man was not the strongest among the many creatures that had emerged from the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison. At most, it could only be considered to be above average. However, his position was the one that was closest to the front. There was no other reason than that he had reacted the fastest when he had been summoned by the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison. Moreover, the place where he had been suppressed was the closest to the fourth level. It was because of this that he was the first to be in the front. Only then could he be the first to solidify and be the first to speak. Since you have put in so much effort, let's forget about our previous grudges. The waxen middle-aged man swept a glance at Luo Fan and said. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Thank you for your magnanimity." His indifferent attitude caused the waxen middle-aged man to feel displeased in his heart. However, he could only suppress his unhappiness. After all, what could he do even if he was unhappy? Before Luo Fan had completely condensed the light of heaven and earth, it was already enough to force him to be suppressed by the Tao Sovereign's prison. Now that the light of heaven and earth had been completely formed, its power was at least 10,000 times stronger than before. It would only be easier for him to do what he had done in the past. In this way, if he continued to pester him, he would be the one to suffer in the end. Don't talk nonsense. Let's talk about our personal grudges after this matter is over. At this moment, an extremely dignified voice directly suppressed all the noise. A young man who looked to be only 16 or 17 years old walked out from the crowd. This young man looked extremely ordinary and did not seem to be extraordinary at all. He stood there as if he was an ordinary creature created from the space-time created by any of the cultivators here. However, whether it was Luo Fan, the waxen middle-aged man, the other creatures in the Tao Sovereign's prison, the jail-breaker king or the other four-eyed creatures, all of them could not help but feel their hair stand on end when they saw this young man. It was as if they had suddenly been stared at by their natural enemy. This kind of terrifying feeling made it impossible for anyone to treat this young man as an ordinary living being. Moreover, if he was an ordinary creature, it was impossible for him to appear here. The jail-breaker king looked at the young man with an extremely ugly expression and said with difficulty, "Who are you? An existence like you can't be suppressed in the purgatory. As an intruder, there are still many things you need to understand." The young man said indifferently. His voice seemed to be the voice of the entire Tao Sovereign's path and was filled with an extremely strong and absolute charm. Even the endless creation power in the fourth level involuntarily changed as he spoke, as if it had naturally evolved millions of heaven and earth, space-time, and worlds to respond to his words. At this moment, the area that had been eroded and assimilated began to tremble abnormally. In this trembling, the essence of the Tao Sovereign's path that should not have appeared began to emerge again and violently collided with the assimilated areas, causing the originally calm area to become violent and chaotic. So strong. This is definitely not the strength of the sixth level. At this moment, Luo Fan understood. At least, he could understand the methods of the sixth level, given the waxen middle-aged man's methods. Although he could not fully understand, he was like an ordinary person reading a book from the heavens when faced with this young man's methods. He could not understand the principles behind them at all, nor could he understand the profound mysteries behind them. The jailbreaker king's expression changed drastically and waves of power that Luo Fan could not understand were released from his body. As soon as this power appeared, Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth trembled slightly and retracted, wrapping around Luo Fan's body. It tore open the endless void, tore open the endless creation power, and escaped from the range of the power's radiation and the area that had been assimilated by the intruder. He directly appeared in the extremely distant cluster of worlds. Even after arriving here, he still felt an unimaginable impact from his light of heaven and earth, causing more than half of his world to collapse with a terrifying bang. Even his body had suffered a huge impact, and half of his body had been completely destroyed. This is his true strength? It was only then that Luo Fan reacted, and his heart was filled with indescribable shock. The light of the heavens and earth released wave after wave of mysterious ripples that quickly swept through his body and his world cluster, trying its best to repair the damage to both his body and the world cluster. With this method of repair, his body and his cluster of worlds quickly recovered. However, at the same time, there was also an endless wave of potential that was constantly attacking his body and his body. It was like a seesaw, causing his body to hover between damage and recovery. After a long time, they gradually calmed down and he returned to normal. An inexplicable lingering fear rose in his heart at this moment. The Jailbreaker King was actually this terrifying after fully unleashing his strength. Just the aftermath of the power alone had almost taken his life, and yet he had been entangled with him for so long. It was like putting his neck on the edge of a knife. However, the Jailbreaker King's actions were obviously not without a price. At this moment, the power of the Tao Master's prison began to skyrocket at a speed that was millions of times faster than when the four-eyed creature's aura was triggered by Luo Fan. In the process of Luo Fan doing his best to repair his body and the cluster of worlds, the power of the Tao Master's prison had increased by tens of thousands of times, and it had almost completely filled up the entire void of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Among them, the number of living beings that were dragged into the fourth level by the Tao Master's prison had skyrocketed from the original hundreds of thousands to tens of billions. Although the number was still not comparable to the number of cultivators that originally existed on the fourth level, it was still a spectacular sight. The tens of billions of cultivators were rubbing their palms in the power of the Tao Master's prison, and they could not wait to immediately pounce on the four-eyed creature and fight it out. Waves of shocking murderous intent rose continuously and crushed towards the invaders. At this moment, the Jailbreaker King was already fighting the young man. Of course, calling it a battle might be an overestimation for the Jailbreaker King. Although the strength he displayed made Luo Fan feel fear, and he felt that his previous entanglement with him was like putting his neck under the edge of a knife, but compared to that young man, there was obviously still a gap in their levels. Although Luo Fan could not understand the battle between them, and could not even see it clearly, he could clearly sense that the Jailbreaker King's aura was constantly fluctuating during the battle. It was obvious that he had pushed his means to the limit, and could no longer control his aura as perfectly as before. On the other hand, the aura of the young man didn't move at all. It was as if the battle between him and the Hellbreaker King wasn't ongoing at all. His expression was cold, calm, and even indifferent. Every single move he made was unimaginably relaxed. Compared to the Jailbreaker King, who had already unleashed his full strength and was putting his life on the line, the other four-eyed creature did not fall behind and also unleashed their full strength. Chapter 2287. However, the attacks of the four-eyed creatures were not without side effects. As they launched their attacks, the power of the Tao Master's prison began to surge out crazily like a huge gap in a huge pond. The power constantly poured into the fourth floor, causing the power of the Tao Master's prison to grow at a faster speed, and its ability to resist the attacks of the four-eyed creatures continued to increase. Although the speed of increase was not as fast as that of the attacks of the four-eyed creatures, obviously, the four-eyed creatures were well aware of this. However, they still did it. Then, their goal was obvious. They wanted to take advantage of the time difference between the growth and the growth. What on earth do they want to do? Luo Fan, who had not yet recovered from the shock, was puzzled by the choice of the four-eyed creatures. Now that the power of the Tao Master's path had penetrated through the fourth floor, numerous experts were constantly pouring into the fourth floor. As the host and the guests were in different positions, it was obvious that they were doomed to fail. Under such circumstances, it did not make sense for them to fight so desperately. While Luo Fan was bewildered, the battle on the other side did not stop because of his bewilderment. At this moment, the number of cultivators who had entered the fourth floor through the power of the Tao Master's prison was constantly increasing, and the resistance of these cultivators against the four-eyed creatures was constantly increasing. The aftermath of their battle was also constantly increasing, and the scene was becoming more and more tragic and terrifying. The area that had been assimilated by the invaders was constantly broken and restored. During this process, the charm that belonged to the other universe became less and less. In other words, the charm that belonged to this universe, or the road of Tao Master, became stronger and stronger. Obviously, the Hellbreaker King was the absolute leader among the many four-eyed creatures. His means were even more powerful than those of the other four-eyed creatures combined. Even so, he was exhausted from running for his life when facing that young man. What he was using was a technique that Luo Fan could not understand. Facing the young cultivator, Luo Fan could not understand the technique that Luo Fan was using, and he could only barely hold on. This caused his expression to become extremely serious and nervous, not to mention helping the other four-eyed creatures. Because of that, the situation became more and more terrible for the four-eyed creature. Despite the dire circumstances of the battle, the four-eyed creatures were gradually beginning to suffer casualties. The four-eyed creatures were shattered by the chaotic attacks and turned into nothingness. Of course, this was a war after all. Even though it seemed to be one-sided, it was impossible for only one side to suffer losses. On the other side, the cultivators that had borrowed the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison to descend were also constantly injured. Occasionally, there would be cultivators who, due to bad luck or insufficient strength, would die in battle with their enemies, with their souls dispersing. Even Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly at the cruelty of war. Normally speaking, it was not easy to kill powerful existences like these cultivators who participated in the war. Even Luo Fan had to make sufficient preparations to achieve this. He had to carefully consider all kinds of situations, calculate strictly, prevent all possible loopholes, and consider all possible trump cards that the other party might have in order to achieve this. However, in this war, such experts were like ants that were being wiped out one by one. This kind of cruelty was enough to move anyone. There's no point in doing this. At this moment, the young cultivator who was about 16 or 17 years old spoke indifferently. Even though there were countless battles erupting on the entire fourth level, his voice could not be concealed. It was clearly heard by all the cultivators on the fourth level. "How is there no point?" the Hell Troublemaker King said in a flustered manner. As he spoke, he had already blocked the young man's attack that Luo Fan could not even see. His body rumbled a few times and collapsed and condensed several times. Then, he said in an even more flustered manner, "Do you think we're only attacking this level? There's no reason for you to attack the other levels. Once you attack, you'll be the ones to suffer. I don't believe that your higher-ups would be so unwise," the young man said indifferently. From the looks of it, he did not seem to be deceived by the Hell Troublemaker King's ambiguous words at all. Hearing this, the Hell Troublemaker King laughed out loud and said, "War agreement? You're still concerned about the war agreement?" The young man's expression changed slightly. The war agreement was an agreement that was signed by many great realms. If any great realm violated the agreement, all the great realms that had signed the agreement would band together to attack it. As far as the young man knew, there were more than 1,000,000 great realms that had signed the war agreement. This was only what he knew. There might be even more that he did not know. With so many great heavens and earths, even if they were only acting perfunctorily and sending a few experts to participate in this kind of siege, the combined power was enough to make any great heavens and earths, or in other words, any true sage path unable to bear the consequences. With this understanding, he did not believe that any great realm would not care about the war agreement. "What do you mean?" The young cultivator's expression became inexplicably ugly. Clearly, he could not understand what the Hell Troublemaker King was talking about. "Ha ha! So you don't know?" The Hell Troublemaker King laughed heartily. There was an indescribable contempt on his face, as if he was a high and mighty god overlooking a slave in the mortal world. This expression made the young man frown. Although his temperament did not allow him to be annoyed by such an attitude, he was still a little displeased. If the war agreement is invalid, there's only one possibility, and that is that the benefits obtained are enough to suppress their fear of the punishment stipulated in the war agreement. What kind of benefits is that? At this moment, various inexplicable guesses flashed through the young man's mind. However, it was a pity that he had been in charge of the Tao Master's prison for too long and was not very clear about the current situation in the chaotic state. No matter how he thought about it, he could not figure out what kind of benefits would cause such a situation. He's lying. At this moment, the fourth senior brother spoke up. The fourth senior brother's words aroused the young man's curiosity. As the original ruler of the fourth level, the fourth senior brother's status had exceeded the level he should have been at. Under such circumstances, it was inevitable that he would know some information that he should not know under normal circumstances. Now that he had said this, it was obvious that he was not speaking without thinking. For the young cultivator, who was already out of touch with the situation in the outside world, it was natural for him to be interested in the contents of the fourth senior brother's words. Lying? Then you can take it that I'm lying. The Hell Troublemaker King chuckled, looking very indifferent. As he smiled, the other four-eyed creatures around him, who could split their attention, also smiled in agreement. The disdain on their faces was simply too obvious. If you really have no scruples about the war agreement, why did you wait until the ruler of this level was taken away by the rogue cultivators before invading this level? The fourth senior brother only laughed coldly. He clearly remembered that back then, the Hell Troublemaker King had said that he dared to invade this level because the ruler of this level was no longer under the Tao Master's tutelage. This clearly meant that the Hell Troublemaker King still had scruples about the war agreement, which contradicted what he had just said. Hearing this, the young man frowned. The fourth senior brother's words greatly reduced his trust in the Hell Troublemaker King's words. These two contradictory statements came from the same person, which meant that the Hell Troublemaker King had to be lying once. It was either this time or the previous time. Regardless of which time it was, it meant that the credibility of the Hell Troublemaker King's words was no longer at a level that he could trust. It doesn't matter if what he said is true or false. We'll do our best to stop what he wants to do. There's nothing wrong with that. At this moment, a voice rang in the young man's ears. Hearing this voice, the young man's body trembled. He swept his perception over and discovered that the person who had spoken was the rogue cultivator who had forcibly taken the ruler of the fourth level from the fourth senior brother. It was also the cultivator with great potential who had allowed them to break through the restrictions and enter the fourth level through all kinds of hard work. Luo Fan. The young cultivator actually had rather complicated feelings about Luo Fan. Given his identity as the Tao Master's tutelage, he clearly detested the fact that Luo Fan had taken away the ruler of the fourth level. If he had met Luo Fan under other conditions, he would never have minded erasing Luo Fan. However, judging from the various efforts that Luo Fan had made after the Hell Troublemaker King's invasion, he had contributed greatly to the Tao Master's path and even to the Tao Master universe. From this point of view, he had a very good impression of Luo Fan. Such a good impression and a bad impression intertwined naturally formed an inexplicable complex feeling, making him not know how to treat Luo Fan. However, regardless of whether it was a good impression or a bad impression, there was one thing that he had to admit, no matter how he considered it. That was Luo Fan's brilliant methods, outstanding wisdom, and unique vision. If it wasn't for his brilliant methods, outstanding wisdom, and unique vision, how could he have done those things that made the young cultivator have a good and bad impression of him? With this understanding, he was naturally willing to think about Luo Fan's suggestion. As he thought about it, he quickly realized that Luo Fan's suggestion was the best way to get rid of this puzzle. No matter what the situation was, no matter what kind of punishment the four-eyed creature would suffer in the future, for now they were enemies. Since he didn't know the enemy's goal, and didn't understand why the enemy had such confidence, then he shouldn't care about anything and just stop the enemy from doing what he wanted. Stopping the enemy from doing what he wanted would be a success. With this in mind, the young cultivator cast aside all the doubts in his mind and said, "That's how it should be." After he finished speaking, he nodded slightly towards Luo Fan, then turned around and ignored him. His body released all kinds of invisible power that Luo Fan could not understand or even sense, and began to press down on the four-eyed creature in front of him. Amidst the incomprehensible changes, more than half of the four-eyed creatures seemed to have been slapped by an incomparably huge invisible hand. They directly crossed the endless power of creation, transcended the infinite mysteries, and directly pounced into the hole that had been blasted open on the fourth floor, and directly returned to the other power of the Tao Master's purgatory. Although the remaining four-eyed creatures weren't directly slapped back, they also became more and more nervous. Their bodies released endless strange lights, powers, and magic, and so on, all trying their best to resist the mysterious power that Luo Fan couldn't sense or understand. In contrast to the many four-eyed creatures, the Hell Troublemaker King seemed to be a lot more relaxed at this moment. After all, the young cultivator had completely targeted him with all kinds of methods and powers. Not only did the Hell Troublemaker King need to wholeheartedly resist, but even so, it was still difficult for him to resist. He could only keep retreating, looking more and more miserable. However, even though the young cultivator still didn't let him go completely, he had already diverted most of the attacks that were targeted at him to the other four-eyed creatures. As a result, the Hell Troublemaker King was naturally a lot more relaxed, and he didn't have to be as miserable as before, of course. It was just that he was no longer in a sorry state because the young cultivator was much more powerful than him. At this moment, even the little bit of power that the young cultivator could draw out was enough to entangle him, causing him to be unable to spare any energy to carry out any other plans. Seeing this, the Hell Troublemaker King showed an anxious expression and said, "Don't you want to know why I don't care about the war agreement?" Hearing this, the young cultivator smiled faintly and said, "I was interested just now, but I'm no longer interested now." What he said was not a lie, but from the bottom of his heart. If the Hell Troublemaker King didn't show that he cared about his methods and didn't show that he was affected by his determination to end the battle quickly, he naturally wouldn't be sure that his methods had worked. However, now that the Hell Troublemaker King was so anxious, he clearly knew that his methods had ruined the other party's plan. As such, was there a need to say what he should do?